Vincent Bugliosi, you've written about real crime stories, the 2000 presidential election, the Kennedy assassination, and you've also written about the war on drugs. How do you choose your topics?
Well, in the early years, I wrote about true crime. But what motivates me in the most recent years by far is some degree of anger. If I'm not angry about something, upset about something, I don't write. My current book is motivated solely by my anger over George Bush, for whom I have a lot of contempt.
This is the book you're working on currently?
Yeah, and it's going to be coming out in May. Here's a guy who is responsible for over 100,000 people in their graves, including 4,000 American soldiers in their cold graves. And I think he took the nation to war under false pretenses. And the evidence is overwhelming, Peter, that through it all, during this hell on earth that he's created in Iraq, he's enjoyed himself. Had a lot of fun, smiled, had his blueberry pie and hot dogs. And so I'm going to be writing a book on him. It's going to be the hardest hitting book yet against Bush for taking this nation to war under false pretenses. So if I'm not upset about something, I don't write. I don't view myself as a professional writer. My wife gets mad at me when I say that because I do write full time. But my conception of myself is that I'm a trial lawyer who happens to be writing as opposed to a writer who happens to be a trial lawyer. But I do have my voice. I mean, I write in a certain style, and I write full time, 7 days a week.
Mr. Bugliosi, most of your books, all of your books, in fact, have a legal angle to them. Will your new book on George W. Bush have a legal angle?
Definitely.
How so?
Well, I don't want to get into the details. My publisher doesn't want me to talk about it, but there's going to be a lot of law in it, and it's going to be a harsh, very harsh attack. I don't write pablum. Some of these things by Moore and Franklin, they're good people, their heart's in the right place, but it's just pablum.
One of your books, The Phoenix Solution, is about the drug war. What were you angry about when it came to the war on drugs?
Oh, I see that stack of books you got there. All of these books here are based on a lot of facts, a tremendous amount of facts. And since that time, my alleged mind has been inundated and cluttered with thousands of other facts. I'll get into reclaiming history in a moment. To give you an example, it was believed, and I don't know if this is true or not, but it was believed that the Warren Report was the most heavily sourced, with citations, nonfiction book ever. 6,500 citations. Reclaiming History has over 10,000 citations, 170 pages on the CD of citations. And the book is higher, wider, smaller print. It would be about 250 to 300 pages in a regular book of citations, a whole book. These are citations to facts. What I'm saying is I'll do my best to resurrect in my mind for you the facts of some of these cases. But they go back a long time. I mean, Helter Skelter, 1974, that's over a quarter of a century ago. Now you're asking me about the drug thing, which is way, way, way behind me. I started writing the first book on drugs in 1989. At the time that I wrote, it was called Drugs in America, The Case for Victory, and then it came out in 1996 again under the Phoenix Solution. It was the #1 problem in America, according to polls. The first President Bush, his first press conference from the White House, he held up a bundle of cocaine bought outside the White House on the street. So it was the #1 problem. It continues to be a terrible, terrible problem in this country, claiming thousands of lives, destroying many, many other lives, and contributing in a great way to the present crime problem in America. Because these addicts, to support their habit, they steal, burglarize, rob. Many murders are drug-related. And it's still a very, very serious problem. I think it's the nation's most serious internal problem. But the media, for whatever reason, lost interest in it, and now it doesn't show up high on the polls. So why did I write the book? Well, I was obviously upset about the drug problem in America because it was extremely serious. at that time. And just looking back, as you're asking me, to go back to 1989, I think the book was based on a couple premises in realities. Number one, if we're serious about solving this drug problem, and I don't believe that we are. I don't believe that we are. I mean, certainly presidential administrations would love to solve the problem, but they're not willing to cross the street in the rain without an umbrella to do so. But we're really not serious about it. And we use the war metaphor, a drug war. It bears no relation to a real war. This nation shows what it does when it's serious about something. The first President Bush, Persian Gulf War, within a matter of a couple of months, he mobilized an incredible military force of 500,000 men and women, persuaded 27 nations to join in the anti-Iraqi coalition. And it was all over oil. We didn't want the price of gas to go up in America. If they grew avocados in Kuwait, there wouldn't have been any war. That's what we do when we're serious about the problem. That was in 1991. And to contrast that, in 1992, the very next year, same president, he's at a summit, drug summit, San Antonio, Texas, with the 3 presidents of the Andean nations, Bolivia, Peru, Colombia. And he asked them, not demands, mind you, he asked them if they will cut down on their production of cocaine 50% in the following 10 years. Now, the previous year, could you imagine that president asking Saddam Hussein if he would remove 50% of his troops from Kuwait within a 10-year period? So we're not serious about the drug problem. And my point is that either we're serious or we're not serious. If we're serious, then since the problem is extremely severe, no question about that, then equally severe methods, revolutionary methods, have to be employed to solve the problem. And I think that was one premise of the book that you're talking about. Another premise is I do not accept the proposition that a handful of drug lords in Colombia, which was the biggest source at the time, and it still is, but Mexico now is very big, as you well know. I can't believe that a handful of drug lords in these 2 countries can cause a tremendous amount of damage to the health and welfare of this country. And this nation is supposed to be it is the most powerful nation on earth. Can't do anything about it. We don't have the physical means to do anything about it. I don't believe that. Probably the main reason for that book that you're talking about is why do we continue to use these old, tired methods of solving the drug problem. I'm talking about law enforcement, eradication, interdiction, when we know they don't work. I mean, if we don't know after close to 100 years, we're never going to learn. When you do something over and over and over again and you get the same result, what type of thinking would cause people to think that if we continue to use this failed system, somehow it's going to suddenly start working? If it rains long and hard enough, maybe the rain will stop being wet. Law enforcement, former, and again, I'm going back as you're asking about cases a long time ago, but former U.S. Attorney General Richard Thornburg, I think he capsulized the general consensus in law enforcement. He said, if you want to solve the drug problem, just leave it to law enforcement. You can't arrest your way out of this problem. Eradication, impossible. You spray the crop or you cut the coca crop, and then it turns up somewhere else. In fact, the very place where you've sprayed it or cut it, once you leave, they replant it again. Interdiction, absolutely impossible. You can analogize it to grabbing a balloon and it bulges out somewhere else. Look, to put it into a realistic perspective, we couldn't even interdict the Ho Chi Minh Trail. That's a trail, as you know, from North Vietnam, communist North Vietnam, into South Vietnam for supplies. Couldn't interdict it. It's about 50, 60 feet wide. Now, if we can't interdict that, how in the world can we interdict the flow of drugs into this country over a southern border alone? I'm not talking about the east and west of the Canadian border, of close to 4,000 miles. And unlike the Ho Chi Minh Trail, we're not just talking about the ground, we're talking about the air above it. So I wrote the book, came up with some revolutionary solutions. Obviously, it was never intended to sell well. It was a white paper, as you will, a roadmap, if the federal government was serious about solving the drug problem. And I testified in front of Congress, but they didn't pay any attention to it. One thing I said is that we have to make these drug lords realize that if they continue their trade, they're going to pay with their life. There's a high probability, not a possibility, a high probability they're going to pay with their lives. As you know, they don't have that fear. Are you aware of that? They have no fear at all of that? Were you aware of that? Okay. Well, Colombia doesn't have the death penalty, okay? And when we extradite these drug lords to this country, where we do have the death penalty, as of 1994, in 1991, my first book, I recommended the death penalty for these people. In 1994, we have it. But a provision of extradition, they're not going to extradite from Colombia here or Mexico here if we're going to execute these people. So they don't have that fear. But people want to live, you know. They want to live another day. And we're going to have to convince these people. Now, that gets into the whole issue of the military, which we don't have time to get into here. The law of posse comitatus goes way back to 1878. It's a post-Reconstruction era statute. And the present government, not just the present, but their predecessors, they believe that that law of posse comitatus prohibits the military from engaging in law enforcement functions. It doesn't. I've looked at the 1878 statute, the legislative hearings, congressional intent. It was only intended to have a domestic application. But that was one revolutionary method that I came up with. The second one, and then I'm sure you want to get onto these other books. The second one takes cognizance of the fact, Peter, that these drug lords, they only have one motive, and that's the profit motive. The most famous drug cartel of all was the Medellin cartel. That's a town in Colombia. Pablo Escobar, you've heard that name? There were three of them, Gacha, Rodriguez, and Escobar. Two of them didn't even use drugs. So it has nothing to do with drugs. They're in it to make the money. And in those days, not now, but in those days when drugs was big and the media was covering, and it's still big, but the media is not covering it, you'd see these, on the evening news, you'd see these press conferences. Always a record seizure. I don't know how it was, but it was always a record seizure. And you'd see local and state law enforcement, a couple of DEA officers, be standing behind a table. Kind of an inscrutable look on their face. I was never able to figure out what that look was. Were they shocked that they had found all these drugs? Were they happy about it? I couldn't tell. It was inscrutable, but they were standing behind there. And on the table, you see these huge stacks of currency. That's drug money that was scheduled to go back to Colombia, Gacha, Rodriguez, and Escobar, because they were responsible for 90% of the drugs coming into this country, and all these bundles of cocaine. And it entered my mind because, see, the main way that these drug lords get their money out of this country, believe it or not, are in its bulk currency form. Another way is by wire transfers, which becomes very, very complex, and we're not going to get into that here. But they literally transfer this money out of the country. So the thought entered my mind, I don't know why it did, I was just looking at all this drug currency. I said, what if that drug currency never had any value once it left the geographical perimeters of this country? And that led to my proposal for a dual currency, a currency that's only exchangeable for goods in this country, and then a foreign currency for Americans traveling to other countries, tourists, and they want American dollars. So all that drug money, once it left this country, wouldn't have any value. Now, again, I remind you, you may say, well, that's kind of draconian, but either we're serious about solving this drug problem or we're not. And none of my methods have been adopted, and I realize I was on the what show was it? Good Morning America, and they said, Mr. Bugliosi, what do you think the likelihood is that they're going to follow this? And I said, probably 1 out of 100. And well, why are you doing it then? And I said, well, the problem is sufficiently severe to warrant the effort. But they're not going to do that. But I'll tell you this, if they started throwing presidents out of office, the electorate, for not solving these problems, you'd see very quickly all types of solutions to the drug problem.
Welcome to In Depth. This is Book TV's 3-hour program with one author taking calls. It's live. It's every first Sunday of the month. This Sunday we have Vincent Bugliosi, author of 11 books, as our guest. This is his most recent book, Reclaiming History, The Assassination of President John Kennedy. About 1,500 pages. We'll talk about this. This was his first book, Helter Skelter, The True Story of the Manson Murders. This was published in 1974. Want to put the numbers up on the screen so that you can participate if you'd like the chance to talk with Mr. Bugliosi. 202 is the area code for all of our numbers. 737-0001 for Democrats, 737-0002 for Republicans. And booktv@cspan.org is our email address in case you want to send it an email, and we've already received some of those. Mr. Bugliosi, you were a prosecutor for several years in Los Angeles, and that's how this book came about. Right. Did you consider yourself a writer before Helter Skelter?
No, and I was very fortunate to have a great co-author, Kurt Gentry, a professional writer, and he's a great historian also, and I co-authored the book with him. The reason for that book is that during the trial there were all types of books coming out on the case, you know, and I'd glance and pick them up and I'd say, hey, where did they get this? It never happened. And I felt that the case was of sufficient importance. It was the biggest murder case that they had had up in L.A. Up to that time. The Simpson case has overshadowed that, but it was the biggest case up to that time, and there were certain sociological implications. So I said someone should do a book that people at a later time could look back and say, this is the book on the case, this is what happened. So it ended up Helter Skelter. The first publisher, by the way, wanted it out in 1 year. I think it was G.P. Putnam, and Mr. Gentry and I, we couldn't do it. They canceled us, and we went over to W.W. Norton and Bantam in the paperback, and as you know, it ended up selling well. And
how many copies have sold of this book?
Well, it's the biggest selling true crime book in publishing history. It's up around 7 million. I'm not rich, by the way. People think I am. They've heard the name. But it's sold around 7 million copies. In Cold Blood had been 4 million for years, but then it came out again with 2 movies, and I think it's up around 5 million now. But they felt that after a year, people would not be interested in the case. But even to this very day, people are interested in the Manson case.
How is it that you happen to be the prosecutor for this case?
Well, you know, you're asking me a question that if I tell you the truth, it sounds like I'm boasting. But obviously, if you're the DA, it's a political office. And you got to win the big cases. So they don't just dip into a hat and pull out a name. You want me to be candid with you? Okay, well, I had, up to that point, I had gotten up to be probably the #1 trial lawyer in the office. There had been a DA series called The DA. Robert Conrad portrayed himself after me, even prior to this case. The DA, his son, went to Harvard Law School. When he was home for the summer, he had him tag around. So I guess the DA felt confidence in me that I could handle a case of this magnitude and complexity. I had one real co-author in the case, not co-author, co-prosecutor, Aaron Stovitz. And Aaron had been in the office for 20 years. Aaron, unfortunately, was taken off the case. He shouldn't have been, but he was for violating the so-called gag order. I don't think he did. And from that point on, basically, I was by myself on it. But I was selected to try the case because the DA had confidence in me, and I was honored that he did.
Where is Charles Manson today?
Where is he today?
Where is he today?
It's a state prison called Corcoran in central California, about 60 miles south of Fresno. People forget that he was sentenced to death. I asked for the death penalty in this case. I told the jury that if this is not a proper case for the imposition of the death penalty, no case ever would be. In fact, I challenged the jury. I said, if you're not willing to come back with a verdict of death in this case, then let's abolish the death penalty in the state of California. I mean, how many people do you have to kill to get the death penalty? And they did return a verdict of death against all defendants. But then, well, the murders were in '69. The trial was in 1771. It was a 9-month trial. The next year, the California Supreme Court and U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the death penalty was unconstitutional, not per se, but the way it was being implemented by the states. They made their ruling retroactive, and everyone on death row around the country, there was close to 600 people, including Manson and his co-defendants, all of their death penalty sentences were irreversibly reduced from death down to life imprisonment. So now Manson is serving a life sentence in the state of California.
What about the three women? Leslie Van Houten, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Susan Atkins, are they still all alive and in prison?
Yeah, they're all alive and in prison, yeah.
Yearly they ask for parole, correct?
Right, right.
What are your thoughts?
Well, my guess, and I don't have any pipeline to the parole board, my guess is that Leslie Van Houten may get out sometime down the line. There's a lot of support for her. Now, you got to realize she was not involved in the 5 Tate murders. She was only involved in the 2 LaBianca murders.
Only.
The others may get out sometime down the line.
Do you support that?
Not Manson. I mean, Manson is so notorious, it would create such an outrage that even in California, which does not have a good record of keeping people behind bars, I'm very confident he'll spend the rest of his life behind bars. And Tex Watson, his main killer, he's not going to get out. The girls, I just have this sense that somewhere down the line they're going to get out. And the first one has to be, if they're going to let anyone out, Leslie Van Houten.
Do you support that?
No. No, I mean, because, you know, she participated in 2 of the murders. One of the victims was Rosemary LaBianca. Rosemary LaBianca had 13 post-mortem wounds, meaning she had already died and they continued to stab. And Leslie said, you know, the more I stabbed, the more I enjoyed it. You know, I mean, if she had been convicted today, and you're convicted of 2 murders, under California law, the only option is death or life without the possibility of parole. At the time she was convicted, they could apply for parole after 7 years. So if justice means anything in America, I think they should spend the rest of their lives behind bars. I think they should be very, very happy that their life was spared. Now to take it to the next level and say we want to be set free, I'd be opposed to that.
Before we go to calls, 2 more books I want to show to our audience. No Island of Sanity, Paula Jones versus Bill Clinton, and The Betrayal of America, How the Supreme Court Undermined the Constitution and Chose Our President. Why don't you just give a brief synopsis of these 2 books?
A brief synopsis. You know, I can't do anything in a couple words. Which one you want me to talk about first?
Why don't we start with Paula Jones and then we'll go to Betrayal.
Well, the Paula Jones case, when her lawsuit against Clinton for sexual harassment, and again, you're asking me to go way, way back in time, but I think it reached the Supreme Court in 1997, and Clinton asked for a continuance of the lawsuit until the end of his term, because he didn't want to go down a little rock in the middle of his term for 2, 3, 4 weeks. And someone's not bringing you your coffee, I see. Don't you have a second cup right there?
That's okay.
Okay. Anyway, everyone, not everyone, but the overwhelming majority of people in America were opposed to the continuance. And they were mouthing this old bromide, no one is above the law, not even the president. Well, Clinton was not asking for immunity. He was asking for a simple continuance. And yet everyone was against the continuance. No one's above the law. And then when the court finally ruled that he was not going to be given a continuance, virtually the entire country again was very happy about it. I couldn't find any major American newspaper, magazine that was not in favor of it. The New Yorker, I think, summarized it, that it drew wide praise for enunciating or reflecting this bedrock American principle that no one is above the law. Even those people who felt that the decision was unfortunate, they weren't happy about it, people who should have known better. Lawrence Tribe teaches constitutional law, Harvard Law School, National Law Journal. They said, even though it's unfortunate, the court had no choice. No one's above the law. Well, I decided to write the book because the court did have a choice. And the Washington Post and New York Times agreed with No Island, taking a position that was very much against the position that these same papers, other people, the papers, had taken. Here's what this case comes down to, are someone supposed to be giving you something? Because you constantly...
I'm looking up at the screen.
I'm looking at you, and you're acting like you need a cup of coffee or something.
No, I'm just looking at the screen to see what the next call is, so that's all.
Okay, well, I'm looking at you, and you're...
Apologize for that.
No, you do what you think. You do your thing. I'm just saying, it looked like you wanted something very badly here. Where was I? You can't tell me because you're not listening to me.
Tell you what. So you wrote this continuation. We were talking about the continuation.
Here's where I was. I wanted to get on the main issue here. The main issue is this. Whenever the United States Supreme Court, or any court in the land, I don't care if it's a Malibu municipal court or some court up in Fargo, whenever a court is confronted with a situation where a private, a valid, that's the key word, a valid private interest, here, Paula Jones's right to an immediate trial, is in conflict with a valid public interest, here, the right of 270 million Americans to have a president that can perform his duties undeterred by the tremendous distraction of a private lawsuit. The court must. It has no choice. If one of the interests is invalid, then you have a choice. But if they're both valid, they have no choice, and all courts in the land balance the interests. I remember that from my constitutional law course in school. They always do it because they have no choice. To see which interest outweighs the other, which is the one that's entitled to the most judicial protection. In the Paula Jones case, for some strange reason, almost mysterious reason, the court did not balance the interest. If you read the opinion, I can't tell you why, they focused in exclusively on Paula Jones's right to an immediate trial, totally overlooking the national interest. Now, if they had balanced the interest, under what conceivable argument under the moon could you make the argument that Paula Jones's individual right to a speedy trial outweighs and is more important than the right of 270 million Americans to have a full-time president perform his duties undeterred by a private lawsuit? It's absurd on its face. Under the, if I can remember the name of it's the Soldiers and Sailors Civil Relief Act. I think it came out in 1940. A buck private, Fort Benning, Georgia, even during peacetime, is immune or is legally entitled to have all civil lawsuits against him continue to the end of his active duty. Why? So that he can devote all of his attention, all of his energies towards his duties. What are his duties at that point? Probably to learn how to assemble and disassemble an M16 rifle. Yet the President of the United States, who has the most important, demanding job on earth, he's not. I mean, under what previously recognized form of logic would that apply?
Let's talk about the other book after we get some calls in. Santa Cruz, California, you're first up with Vincent Bugliosi.
Good morning, or good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
If you look at it the way it was with President Clinton, now look at it the exact opposite now the way it is with President Bush, with all the things that he has done and he has not been held accountable. I'm wondering if, because he's president, how he's getting, is there any way for him not to be able to get away with what he's doing, what he's done, all these 100,000 people that are now gone off the planet, and our boys, our young men, not to mention the treasure, and that it's just a complete calamity.
Well, you're confusing a civil lawsuit from a criminal lawsuit. In a criminal lawsuit, it's people of the state of California versus so-and-so, or the federal government, United States versus so-and-so. When you're talking about crimes that you just mentioned, only the federal government or the state government can apply. I was referring to a civil lawsuit. The parallel would be some guy down in Waco, Texas, who entered into a contract with President Bush several years ago. Now he's alleging a breach of contract, thousands of papers, hundreds of documents. Now, is Bush supposed to go down to Waco, Texas for a whole month in the middle of his term to to defend himself against that lawsuit. It's preposterous on its face. And by the way, the court in Jones versus Clinton, they made no distinction between peacetime and wartime. So it was a crazy decision on its face, and yet, and I'm not a constitutional scholar, I'm the only one who wrote a book on that case. Apparently there was a group of professors that were going to do so, but that's the only book that was written on this case. And I might say, tying in what this person said, that case, the Paula Jones case, in a way, but for causation, is responsible for the Iraqi war. You want to know how? I'll tell you how. Tell me if I'm off base, okay? Be candid with me as I'm being candid with you today. Before Clinton settled that lawsuit, okay, Paula Jones's lawyer took a deposition from Clinton. And in that deposition, he denied having sex with Monica Lewinsky. It's a question that never should have been asked, and the judge later said that question was an improper question. I should never have allowed it to happen, and in the trial, it's not relevant. I could tell you why it's not relevant, but we don't have to get into that issue. So he denied having sex. He lied about having sex with Monica Lewinsky. At which point, the monstrous, grotesque Ken Starr, whom I view as being one of the most reprehensible figures in American history, the DA of Manhattan said that Starr violated every prosecutorial rule in the book. He jumped in, seized on it, and almost brought the Clinton administration to its knees. Here's a guy that was set up in Washington, D.C., asking people to call him, you know, checking the private consensual sex life of the president. He first started out in Watergate 20 years earlier. Couldn't find anything, so then he decided to check the private consensual lawsuit of the president. Okay, so he's investigating this thing, $70 million effort, 7-year effort, comes out with a report. I don't know how many pages it was, but it was a thick, thick report. 4 references to, not Watergate, Whitewater. Over 500 references to sex. And he kept repeating himself. But poor Ken couldn't find the space in his report, and I understand there was a space problem. It was a 450-page book where Monica Lewinsky testified in front of the federal grand jury. President Clinton did not ask me to lie, and no one promised me any job for my testimony. Ken couldn't find any space in his book for that. But would he have found space if she had said that he asked me to lie and I was promised a job? Yeah. I'm going off on a tributary. Where am I again now? You know when you get old, you go off on a tributary and you forget where you were.
You were going to tie the Iraq War to this decision.
Right. Okay. So almost brings down the Clinton administration. And just about everyone agrees it was to Gore's detriment. That scandal slopped over into Gore. The election came down to a couple hundred votes, as you well know. And Gore compounded it by not utilizing Clinton to gather votes. I guess he's a pretty good vote getter. He distanced himself from it. So the general belief is that without that Monica Lewinsky scandal, Gore would have won the election, and there would not have been an Iraqi war. Now, maybe I'm off base here, but I think there is an umbilical cord between the ruling in the Paula Jones case and the Iraqi war. See the danger of someone calling in? I go off on all these tangents.
Well, let's take another call then. Okay. Springfield, Illinois, you're on with Vincent Bugliosi. This is In Depth on Book TV.
There was an amazing connection there, but I read some of Mr. Bugliosi's books, and I disagree with most of them, though I do commend him on his work on the Manson case. I do think that women have changed, and I do hope they do get parole. If you ever see films of them now, they're obviously different people and they're younger people. But I wanted to talk about the drug issue. I'm a former substance abuser, and I'm now a writer, and I'm a political analyst. And I was listening to Mr. Bugliosi's description of some of his prescriptions for stopping the flow of drugs in America. And my contention is, and I'm a conservative here, my contention is there's a lot of people that don't want to see this flow of drugs into America stopped. I believe that there's a huge failure at the local prosecutors and state's attorneys. Can I just give you an after a number of years and found out some of my friends were still getting high. And I found out who they were buying their drugs from. I called everyone, from the local precinct to the DEA. I couldn't find anyone to go after this person. And I hung up my phone and I said to my wife, they don't want it stopped. And until you stop the demand, this is my point, until you stop the demand at home and prosecutors get serious and people stop living off of this industry, you're not going to stop illegal drug uses, and it's going to hurt America and kill millions of people like it has. So
thank you, caller. Mr. Bugliosi.
Well, he didn't get into how you stop this demand. He avoided that issue, and that's the central issue.
But I think his point was he tried to reach out and nobody cared.
Okay.
Nobody on the law enforcement level.
Yeah, the rebuttal to what he said, go down to any state or federal courtroom, okay? Over 50% of the cases are drug cases. How did they get there? Someone arrested these people. No, the courts are flooded, absolutely flooded with court cases. But you see, I agree with what he says, that if you can stop the use of drugs, fine. The problem is solved. But you can't stop the use of drugs. You can't arrest yourself out of this problem. There's this voracious demand for drugs in this country. So people talk about going to the source, and they say the source is the user. If we can stop him from using, there's no problem. But how do you stop them from using? Can't be done. But just like even Houdini can't pull a rabbit out of the hat when there is no rabbit in the hat, a user can't use drugs if he has no drugs. Other people say, well, eradication. Let's eliminate the coca fields. That'll solve the problem. It's a secondary source because you can't stop it, like I told you. Interdiction, you can't stop it. To me, the primary source of the drug problem is the minds of the drug lords who sets all of these things in motion, the whole process. Coca fields don't have feet of their own. Cocaine laboratories don't have hands of their own. Someone at the top of the pyramid decides to make all these things happen. And if you convince these people, if you make these people not want to do it, it's not going to happen anymore. Now, you're never going to have a solution to the drug problem, but you can reduce it to manageable proportions. And one way is to let these people know. You know, they're reading their paper in Bogota over coffee in the morning, and they say, oh, Jose was just executed in New York City. You know, why do they want to do that when they can go over to Europe and still be billionaires? Now, some people say, well, Mr. Bugliosi, that's terrible. You're sending them over to Europe. Well, what about a home that has barking dogs and an alarm system and someone with a rifle behind the door? I guess they shouldn't have that either, because then the person might go next door. We're talking about helping America. So this fellow here has said some things that have merit, but they don't go anywhere. That's a term in trial lawyers say. Where does it go? And there's a limited amount of merit to what he says because he apparently has not visited courthouses in America. They're absolutely overflowing with drug cases.
Well, two other books that you've written.
And you don't get to drug cases unless someone arrests these people.
Two other books, both true crime stories, Till Death Do Us Part, with Ken Hurwitz, and The Sea Will Tell with Bruce Henderson. In this book, however, And the Sea Will Tell, you went from being a prosecutor to a defense lawyer.
Yeah. Do you want to get into Betrayal of America at all, or
we will get into that,
okay.
But I am interested your switch from being a prosecutor to a defense lawyer.
Well, I was in private practice at the time, and I don't defend people charged with murder unless I think they're innocent.
And you thought Jennifer in this story was innocent?
Yeah, although a lot of people don't agree. I have found that there's a tried and true way of eliminating the unjustly accused from a trial. Because by the time someone reaches that trial level, they've gone through a sifting out process. And chances are the real robber and rapist or murderer is at that console table. He's not somewhere else. So when you have a conviction rate in felony jury trials down to 72 or 75%, it's not because the true defendant was not at the table, but because either the DA or the police did not do their job. So they're almost always guilty. Not always. They're innocent people. But usually it's at the original stage of the arrest. By the time they reach the trial level, you usually got the right guy. And I just don't want to defend these people. I would defend someone charged with murder, even though I knew they were guilty. If I was the only lawyer around, the right to counsel is very sacred in our society, much more important than any personal predilection on my part. We don't have that problem. LA's got 50,000 lawyers stumbling over each other's feet to get the cases. You know how many lawyers went down to the LA County Jail when Charles Manson was down there and signed in? Over 200 lawyers.
To defend him?
Yeah, well, I guess that's why they went down there. Mel Belli offered to represent him free of charge. So we don't have that problem, so I'm free to follow my inclination. There's nothing in the canons of ethics of the American bar that say you have to represent everyone who comes to your door. And I just don't want to defend people charged with murder. I mean, take some vicious person who picks up young girls, sexually abuses them, brutalizes them, then murders them and dumps them on the side of the road. What conceivable reason under the moon would I have? It's not a matter of ethics. It's a matter of motivation. How can I be motivated to work 100 hours a week, knocking myself out, trying to figure out a way to get this murder off? And I'm not unmindful of the fact that if I were to get this murder off, and then he goes out and does it again, I can rationalize all I want. But I'm somehow involved in that second murder. Because if I hadn't deceived the jury the first time around, there wouldn't have been a second murder. So the bottom line is that although I'm not a law and order fanatic, in fact, I'm very suspicious of people who are. I do believe that when someone commits a very, very serious crime, they should be severely punished, and I don't want to be in a position of frustrating this normal justice. So let me give you a little background on And the Sea Will Tell. There's this couple in San Diego, Mac and Muff Graham. They had this incredible boat, 38-foot ketch, double-masted. It's called the Seawind. And they put everything into that Seawind, the best of everything in there. And they had traveled all over the world. But finally, they, to get away from the increasing unsafety and congestion in San Diego, they decided to go to this island in the South Pacific about 1,000 miles south of Honolulu called Palmyra, uninhabited, some small little island. Now, why they wanted to go there, I don't know, but they wanted to go there. They wanted to go there. Also on the island at the time was a fellow by the name of Buck Walker, a fugitive from justice. He was on parole for robbery, sold drugs to an undercover officer in Honolulu. So he was going to go back. If he got to court, he was going to go back because he violated his parole to finish his robbery sentence. So he and his girlfriend, Jennifer Jenkins, whom I ended up defending, they went to Palmyra. They had this sorry little boat, the Iola, not seaworthy at all, but they finally made it there. She studied self-help guides on how to navigate. So you had these two couples, both trying to escape from the world, but for different reasons. And their destinies intersect on this uninhabited island, hundreds of miles from civilization. Now, Mac and Muff, they had the best of food and supplies on the Seawind to last for a whole year. Jennifer and Buck, they didn't have anything. They literally were living off the land, and because of this glaring disparity in lifestyle, and the fact that both went there to be alone, and then they learned they have to share the island with the other couple, there was a certain amount of tension, but they did interact to a certain extent. There was some friendly interaction. Jumping forward, this was in the spring of 1974. The end of the summer of 1974, Mac and Muff vanished from the face of the earth. And Jennifer and Buck turn up with the Seawind in Honolulu. They had re-registered under a different name, repainted it, but it was a very distinctive book, and the sailing community is a small community. They instantly recognized that's the Seawind. So Buck and Jennifer were arrested and prosecuted and convicted for the theft of the Seawind, but not for murder at that point. Now we jump ahead, I think it was November of 1980. There's another couple on the island from Johannesburg, South Africa. And a couple months later, early January 1981, she's taken her daily constitutional walking along the shore of the lagoon, and she sees something glistening in the sun. She gets closer to it, and she recoils and screams. It was a gold-capped tooth in a skull, identified by dental records from San Diego as belonging to Muff Graham, and next to it was this aluminum container, and the lid had come off. Well, at that point, Jennifer and Buck were arrested, prosecuted for murder. Mac's body has never been found to this day. It was the biggest case that Honolulu had ever had. The biggest case since the Massey case in 1931, which was Clarence Darrow's, I think, last murder case. And the polls all showed, high 90s, that they believed that Buck and Jennifer were responsible for these murders. So there was a change of venue motion, and the case was transferred to San Francisco on a change of venue. And at that point, she hired me, and it took me a long time to be convinced of her innocence. Among other things, she had passed the polygraph test. Not with flying colors, but she had passed. So the case went to trial in San Francisco in 1986. It was a one-month trial. If I could summarize the prosecution's case for you, and it was a complex case, but the essence of this case was that 4 people on an island, 2 end up dead, the other 2 end up with their boat, acting suspiciously. 4 minus 2 leaves 2. And my job was to convince the jury that 4 minus 2 leaves 1. Buck Walker was convicted. My client was found not guilty. But I have to say that although I believe Jennifer's innocent, I strongly believe that, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I mean, I wasn't on the island. At one point in the book, I think I say if the dogs could only talk. There were 2 dogs on the island. And every now and then I get because I get letters from people. I get, letters saying that she pulled the wool over my eyes. I get a little chill wondering, is it possible that I got a murderer off? I don't think so at all. I feel very confident I didn't. But I can tell you that if it ever was determined that I got a murderer off, it would bother me very, very much for the rest of my life.
Our guest on In Depth is Vincent Bugliosi. We will be here until about 3 p.m. Eastern Time with Mr. Bugliosi, taking calls, going through his body of work. Next call for him comes from Long Beach, New York. Long Beach, we're going to put you on hold until you get your volume turned down so we don't get the delay. Milwaukee, Wisconsin, you're on with Vincent Bugliosi.
Yes, Mr. Bugliosi, I'm very interested in reading your book. I haven't read it yet, but on the one on the Kennedy assassination. But I read a book that indicated that the theory was that one of the Secret Service men in the car behind Kennedy accidentally shot him by drawing his revolver or weapon at the time he heard the shot from Lee Harvey Oswald. Did you look into that theory? And
yeah, it's covered in the book. It's a book called Mortal Error, and it's just silly. The ammunition from the weapon that this fellow had didn't match the bullets found, but supposedly the gun accidentally went off. No one in the car heard any gun go off. Accidentally went off and killed the president.
Okay.
But this gives you an example of the craziness that's out there that I was dealing with for over 20 years.
You took 20 years to write this book. It's about 1,500 pages. We want to show everybody how thick it is.
Worked on it for 20 years. The last 6 or 7, 70, 80, 90, 100 hours a week, 7 days a week, yeah.
You said before this show began that this took a physical toll on you.
Well, do you want to get into this book now?
Why don't we?
Okay, okay. The reclaiming history possibly took a physical toll on me. Every author has his or her so-called magnum opus. There's no question that that is my magnum opus, the book of my career. Not only is the Kennedy case the most important murder case in American history, arguably altered the course of American history, But I worked on the book for over 20 years, and I put the best into it that I'm capable of. The best that I learned as a criminal prosecutor, as a true crime author, I put into this book. I'm not capable of doing a better book than Reclaiming History. It's the best that I can do. W.W. Norton, the publisher, very distinguished publishing house. I think you know that. It's been in the business for over 80 years. And I was very honored when I was told that the old-timers at W.W. Norton were saying that they were more proud of Reclaiming History than any other book that they had published in the history of that publishing house. And that meant a lot to me. I've been fortunate to have 3 books, true crime books. They got up to #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. And I never boasted about the books, not because I didn't think the world of them, but it just would be, in, I guess you could say, poor taste, unbecoming. Now, I did, as I'm doing now, talked about the intriguing, fascinating facts upon which the books were predicated. But I did talk about the books themselves. But I have to say that it's difficult. Sir, I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. So in walking back and forth,
right.
walking
sorry
back
about that.
forth. Yeah. I have to say that it's difficult for me to speak candidly about Reclaiming History without sounding boastful. And I'll tell you why. Because the alternative is almost worse. Someone could think, well, it's just another one of the close to 1,000 books on the assassination. And it's not. It absolutely is not. I did not write Reclaiming History for the money, although I certainly hoped it would make money. Don't get me wrong, I got to feed the family. But that was not the motivation why I wrote this book. With the increasing superficiality in our society, and I think you'll agree with me on that, Peter, and the desire for instant gratification, and fewer people are reading books. If you want to make money, you don't put out a book of over 1,600 pages. There was a review of a book a couple weeks ago in the New York Times, and the reviewer said that this book was 609 pages, was unreasonably long. Okay, so this is over 1,600 pages, cost $50, very expensive, although as I understand on Amazon.com for some funny reason, I don't know why, it's much more inexpensive. But if you're trying to make money, you don't put out a book of over 1,600 pages with a CD of another 1,100 pages. This book, at over 1.5 million words, is the equivalent of about 13 volumes of 400-page books. So if you want to make money, you don't put out a book like this. I did not write it for the bestseller list. I wrote it, and it sounds presumptuous, and I'm being candid with you. This was my state of mind while I was writing this book. I wrote this book for the ages. That was my state of mind. And the Los Angeles Times, in the review, said, finally someone did it, put all the pieces together. Reclaiming History is a book for the ages. The Wall Street Journal said it was unlike any other book ever written on the assassination, and said it belongs on the shelves alongside the Warren Commission investigation and the House Select Committee on Assassination, the 2 main federal investigations. Now, both of those investigations had large staffs of lawyers and investigators and budgets in the millions of dollars. Philadelphia Inquirer said that 100 years from now, when historians want to know what happened in this case, they're going to read Reclaiming History. The great American novelist Scott Turow said centuries from now, people are going to be reading Reclaiming History. And I think that's the reason why Tom Hanks and his people are going to be doing a 10-hour miniseries on Reclaiming History for HBO. So I'm very, very proud of the book. But again, I'm talking about the book. And it sounds boastful. But the alternative is that, well, it's just another book on the assassination, and it's not. And of course, we learned from Churchill that modesty is not always a virtue. You know, he was running for re-election against Clement Attlee. And I think one of the British journalists says, you know, Sir Winston, you have to agree that Mr. Attlee is a lot more modest than you are. Whereupon Churchill said, yes, but then again, he's got a lot more to be modest about. So modesty is not always a virtue, but I would rather not boast about this book. But if I don't, there's the danger of people saying it's just another of the close to 1,000 books, and it's not. It's a very special book. I'm very proud of it. I may have bit off more than I can chew in writing this book. I have always been immune from the deprivations of work. Work has never, ever bothered me. I used to try 2-3-month murder trials, and at the end of it, I felt nothing at all. And there were other lawyers that tried a 2-3-month drunk driving case, and they'd have to go to Palm Springs to recuperate for a couple of days because of the stress. But I had never met the Kennedy case before. I had met it from a prosecutorial standpoint. That's how I got involved in this case. Did you know that I, quote, prosecuted Oswald in 1986? We can get into that with Jerry Spence.
The mock trial.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. They called it a docu-trial because it was somewhere between a mock trial and a real. We had the original Warren Commission witnesses, no script. They called me and they said, Mr. Bugliosi, we know you have a love affair with your yellow pad. That's the script. We had the original Warren Commission witnesses. We worked on it for close to a half a year. Spence had 2 lawyers in his law firm working full-time on it. And Jerry will tell you the same thing that I did, that he and I worked on this case as hard as any other murder case that we did in our respective careers. Now, again, where was I?
You were talking about the book, the trial, but basically...
no, there was something else we're talking about. I go off...
Mr. Bugliosi, who done
Don't get old, by the way.
Who done it?
Okay, but no, there was something else, some other point that I was trying to make, and I forget where I was, and I went off on this tangent. I just can't remember what I was talking about.
But who done it?
Who done it?
Who done it?
Who done it? Well, Lee Harvey Oswald did it.
Period.
Yeah, well, absolutely.
You list at the end of this book all the conspiracy people who think it's a conspiracy. You list all the groups that could possibly be involved, basically saying that the whole world would have had to conspire to kill President Kennedy.
Yeah, if you listen to these conspiracy theorists, every presidential administration has been trying to cover up, and it's, you cannot believe this. Oliver Stone, for instance, Stone's movie was one continuous lie. I have to qualify that. I have to be fair to Oliver. He had the correct date, November 22nd, 1963, correct victim, the president, correct city, Dallas, but other than that, it was one continuous lie. He had, with his thinking cap turned very tightly to the opposition, he came up with 10 groups that were involved, or he thought was involved, had a motive, and he had them all involved. Even the KGB and CIA, bitter enemies, but they got together on this one. Yeah, they think the whole world's involved. You asked me who did it. Let me try to summarize for you, like I did for Time magazine a couple months ago. They gave me a page on Oswald's guilt. And then I can summarize for you if you're interested in why there's no conspiracy. If we get into the individual conspiracy theories and you ask me about the KGB and I answer you, and then someone out there is going to say, well, what about Castro? What about anti-Castro Cuban exile? What about the right wing? But I'll try to summarize it all for you. I learned as a prosecutor, and you don't have to be a prosecutor, common sense, that if you're innocent of a crime, chances are there's not going to be any evidence at all pointing towards your guilt. Why? Because you're innocent. But because of the nature of life, the unaccountability of certain things, now and then a piece of evidence will point towards your guilt, even though you're innocent. And an extremely unusual, rare situation, maybe even 2, 3 pieces of evidence, strong evidence, point towards your guilt, even though you're innocent. But in this case here, Peter, because you asked me who done it, everything points towards Lee Harvey Oswald's guilt. In the book, I set forth 53 separate pieces of evidence pointing towards Oswald's guilt. And under the circumstances, it would not be humanly possible for Oswald to be innocent, at least not in the world in which we live. I'm talking to you now, you can hear me, there'll be a dawn tomorrow, not in that world. Only in a fantasy world can you have 53 pieces of evidence pointing towards your guilt and still be innocent. I'll just give you a couple brief pieces of evidence. The murder weapon was his, okay? I mean, that's pretty powerful evidence, right? The murder weapon, Mannlicher Carcano rifle, it's owned, possessed by Lee Harvey Oswald. After the shooting in Dealey Plaza, he's the only guy that flees the building. Everyone else is there. They have a roll call. Oswald takes off. 45 minutes later, he kills Officer J.D. Tippett, Dallas Police Department. I told the jury in London during that trial, I said that murder bore the signature of a man in desperate flight from some awful deed. 30 minutes later, he resists arrest, pulls a gun on the arresting officer. During his interrogation by the Dallas Police Department, he told one provable lie after another, all of which showed a consciousness of guilt. When someone tells me they don't think Oswald is guilty, I know one of two things. Either that person is unaware of the evidence or he's just some silly person. Now, on the issue of whether there was a conspiracy, and I'm trying to summarize billions and billions of words that have been written, as I did for time, in just a couple paragraphs. There's no credible, let's italicize the word credible, there's no credible evidence that the CIA, the mob, the military-industrial complex, any of these other groups were behind the assassination. All there is speculation. I told the jury in London, I said, you know, folks, I says, 3 people can keep a secret, I said, but only if 2 are dead. And here now, close to 44 years later, not one word, not one syllable has leaked out. Why? Because there's nothing to leak out, Peter. Number 2, I'm trying to summarize everything for you. There's no evidence that Oswald ever had any connection with any of these groups believed to be behind the assassination. And believe me, the FBI checked out every breath that this guy ever breathed from the moment that he arrived back from the Soviet Union on June 13th, 1962, until the day of the election. 25,000 interviews. No evidence of any connection that he had with any of these groups believed to be behind the assassination. Number 3, let's assume that one of these groups wanted to kill the president. And I reject that out of hand. Literally reject it out of hand. Not in the book. This is the first book that takes on all of the conspiracy theories. No other book has ever done that, and demolishes all of them. So I discuss it in great depth in the book, separate chapters. But between you and me and the lamppost, I reject it out of hand. CIA. Do you know who was the head of the CIA at the time of the Kennedy assassination? His name was John McCone. You know who John McCone was? A personal friend of President Kennedy. He appointed McCone CIA director. Then he's going to turn around and kill him because I guess he didn't invite him to a function at the White House. I mean, it's just crazy on its face. But let's assume, for the sake of argument, that one of these groups wanted to kill the president. Oswald, who we know killed Kennedy, would be one of the last people on the face of this earth whom they would have gone to. Why? He was not an expert shot. He was a good shot, but not an expert shot. He had a $12 mail-order rifle, notoriously unreliable, extremely unstable. I mean, here's a guy, Peter, that defects to the Soviet Union pre-Gorbachev. I mean, even today, who in the world defects to the Soviet Union? And then he gets there, wants to become a Soviet citizen. They turn him down. What does he do? He tries to commit suicide. He slashes his wrists. Just the type of guy, I'm being sarcastic now, just the type of guy that the CIA or mob would want to rely upon to commit the biggest murder in American history. Let's take it a step further, final step. Let's assume that one of these groups, for whatever reason, wanted to kill the president. And they go to Oswald, they want him to be the hitman, and he agrees to do it. Let's see if where that takes us makes any sense. After Oswald shot Kennedy in Dealey Plaza and fled the building, one of 2 things would have happened. Now let me tell you the least likely thing that would have happened. The least likely thing that would have happened, there would have been a car waiting for him there to help him escape down to Mexico, Costa Rica, wherever. Certainly the conspirators wouldn't want their hitman to be apprehended and interrogated by the authorities. That's the least likely thing that would happen. The most likely thing that would happen, I think you already know, Peter, what I'm going to say.
Go ahead.
Well, I'll say it. Well, the most likely thing that would have happened if the CIA or mob or military-industrial complex had Oswald killed Kennedy for him, there would have been a car waiting for him to drive him to his death. You know that would have happened. And yet we know that Oswald's out in the street with $13 in his pocket trying to flag down buses and cabs. That fact alone tells you there was no conspiracy. And in the book I set forth 32 reasons why there was no conspiracy. The presidential motorcade itself that brought the limousine right below the 6th floor window where Oswald was, that wasn't even determined, that route, until November 18th, 1963. Does anyone really believe that the CIA or whatever group is going to conspire with Oswald to kill the president within 4 days of the president's visit to Dallas? That's pure moonshine. It's crazy.
Long Beach, New York, you're on the air. Thanks for holding. Vincent Bugliosi is our guest. Long Beach is gone. We will move on to caller. Where are you calling from?
Orlando, Florida.
You're on, Orlando. Go ahead with your question for Mr. Bugliosi.
Yes, Mr. Bugliosi, it's a real privilege. I have a comment and a question regarding the possible impeachment of President Bush and Vice President Cheney. About a month before we invaded Iraq, President Bush went on television saying that our planes were dropping millions of leaflets all over Iraq, instructing the Iraqi soldiers to stay home, don't fight our troops, and the United States would take care of you and your families. The Iraqi soldiers did go home, and they did not resist our troops. But Paul Bremer, the top civilian leader in Iraq, issued an order dissolving Iraq's army, which numbered about 500,000. These Iraqi soldiers were not part of Saddam's Republican Guard. They were mostly young men who joined the Iraqi army as a means of supporting their families.
Caller, what's your question?
Question. Not too long after Bremer dissolved the Iraqi army, the insurgency began, and the Iraqis started killing our soldiers. As a prosecutor, would you say that Bush, going back on his promise to take care of the Iraqi soldiers, caused the insurgency and the deaths of our soldiers, and shouldn't Bush criminally be charged for such?
Well, I'm not familiar with all the things that you said, ma'am, and therefore I don't want to comment on it. I'm not trying to avoid it, but you said several things that I did not know about. I think I've heard some of them, but again, I don't want to be evasive, but your question presupposes a lot of stuff that I'm unfamiliar with, and I hate to form an opinion on anything without being completely familiar with all the facts. So I'm going to have to pass on that question. But about impeachment, ma'am, you know, we impeach presidents in this country who have consensual sexual relations, private consensual sexual relations. We impeach them. So what you're talking about with Bush is a lot more serious than that. Of course, Clinton also lied in front of the federal grand jury. But you set forth things that I just don't know about. I've heard vaguely, but I'm not in a position to state categorically whether that particular thing would be a ground for impeachment.
What is your take on the Nixon resignation?
Well, I was in favor of the pardon that Ford gave Nixon. Nixon was not a part of that break-in thing. In fact, those tapes show that when he first heard about it, he threw a cup across the room. So he was not a part of it. I took the position more of the Europeans that, again, we have to balance the interests. You don't bring the downfall of an administration over something like this. And also, you know, there's many ways to punish a person. The criminal law is just one of them. And Ford's position, well, that was a good president, deserves more credit than he has gotten. His position is that not only did we not want to put the country through the trauma of a criminal trial, but Nixon had suffered enough. What was his suffering? Well, the greatest hurt that could ever be imposed upon a president, the greatest harm. He had to resign the presidency in disgrace. So he had already suffered tremendously. And I was about to write a book at that time called Watergate, not Watergate, Watergate, yeah. It was Whitewater Watergate. Watergate, America's finest hour of hypocrisy. But other commitments prevented me from doing a book. But since that time, we've gone on to the Clinton thing, which was much less. I mean, whoever dreamt that there'd be an impeachment of a president for private, consensual sexual activity where he's trying to cover it up? That was infinitely less significant than what Nixon did. But even what Nixon did, I was in favor of the pardon that Ford gave Nixon.
Twice in your life you've run for office as a Democrat, correct?
Right.
And you did not win. What offices did you run for?
DA and Attorney General. The second time, not that seriously. The first time, I was teaching at a nighttime law school, and one night a week, and a student of mine literally talked me into running. At first I said, I'm not interested at all, not interested. And he said, well, just think about it. Well, I ended up running, and I ran seriously. And I ran against a fellow whom I respected. He was the DA at the time. His name was Bush, Joe Bush.
A Democrat?
It's a nonpartisan office. Okay. Joe, I can talk about it now because it's come out in the paper. Joe was a good man, a good prosecutor, but he had a drinking problem. He'd start out in the morning drinking, and there was evidence that sometimes he'd have to be carried into his home at night by one of the investigating officers. And one of the investigating officers actually came to me and was willing to call a press conference with me, that he'd have to carry poor Joe into his home at night, and I wasn't interested in that, so I didn't do that. So I ran, and this kid who talked me into running, he had no experience. He became my campaign manager. We were outspent about 7-1. And I found out something about politics. I was just running to be the head of a law office, I thought. Just to be the head of a law office. And I talked about increasing the conviction rate in felony jury trials from 72% up to, it should be about 99%. Having a training program for the deputies, going after industrial polluters, getting into corporate fraud and stuff like that. And they take me around to visit contributors, and I would not ask for money. I knew why I was going there. The person with me would ask for money. And the people, I wanted to talk about the office, and all they want to talk about is, do you have any polls, and how much money do you have in the bank? Anyway, bottom line, even though I was outspent about 7-1, on the day of the election, I actually got over 50% of the vote. And I was overcome on absentee ballots, which were submitted earlier, and I lost by 1/4% out of about 3.5 million votes. But I'm not cut out for politics, but that was my exposure.
Next call for Vincent Bugliosi. Cleveland, you're on the air.
Hi, how are you? In the last week or two, General Alexander Haig stated that he had seen intelligence come across his desk immediately after the death of the president, saying the Cubans were involved, and also on the History Channel they had an hour show about what was in the CIA file about Oswald, excuse me, supposedly meeting with the head assassin in the Western Hemisphere of Soviet military intelligence, the GRU. And I was wondering, what are your comments about that? Before you answer.
Caller, is this a case that you have followed closely over the years?
No, I just watched, I just heard the news, and I just watched the, I think Oswald acted alone. One reason is I visited Dealey Plaza, and I thought it was a very easy shot to kill the president, and this grassy knoll stuff is just nonsense.
All right, thank you. Mr. Bugliosi.
His first question is what now again?
It was about Mr. Oswald visiting with the head assassin.
No, that was the second one.
And that was the History Channel portion of that.
Something about in the system or something. I didn't hear what he said.
Shall I repeat the question?
If you're still there, yes.
I'm very sorry. A week or two ago, General Alexander Haig, who was working in the White House or whatever at the time of the assassination, said that across his desk came intelligence saying that the Cubans were involved with murdering President Kennedy and were involved with Oswald.
Well, there's no evidence whatsoever of this. And I have to say about Haig, he's lost credibility with me. He wrote in his book something that no one has written in any book, and there's no evidence of it, that Bobby Kennedy, according to Haig, was involved in the attempted assassination of Fidel Castro. That's what Haig said. And he had no evidence to support himself, gives no citation, just rumors. Bobby Kennedy was heavily involved in Operation Mongoose, which was to overthrow Kennedy, okay? Castro. He was heavily involved in that, but that's a separate issue from trying to assassinate Castro, which he was not involved in, and there's no evidence of that. And here Haig comes out and makes this extravagant remark. So I would take what Haig says, cum grain of solace, if that's the way you pronounce it, with a grain of salt. I haven't heard about that, but there's going to be 10,000 allegations that are going to continue to be made 3, 4, 5 centuries from now with the Haigs of the world. Now, as far as Oswald meeting with some assassin, yes and no to that. In late September and early October of 1963, Oswald was trying to get to Cuba. He revered Fidel Castro, and he was a strong supporter of the Cuban Revolution. So he went down to Mexico City, went to the Cuban consulate in Mexico City trying to get a visa. He said he wanted to go back to Russia, but he wanted an in-transit visa to Cuba where he was going to stay. And they told him that they'd have to go over to the Russian embassy if he wanted to go to Russia, but he wanted this in-transit visa to Cuba. So he goes over there, and he met with a guy by the name of Kostakov. Kostakov was a member of the KGB. These Russian embassies around the world were staffed by KGB people, and he supposedly was a member of an assassination group at one time. So he did meet with Kostakov along with several other people, and they told him they could not give him this visa to Russia. They could do it, but it would take about 4 months, and he wanted it immediately, and he started yelling and almost coming to tears. So that's the only thing about that. It was Kostakov, and he met with Oswald because Oswald went there seeking a visa to Russia, and the Russian embassy was staffed by KGB people.
When people meet you, Mr. Bugliosi, do they want to talk about the Kennedy assassination or Helter Skelter first?
Well, Helter Skelter, more people have read. They also want to talk about the Simpson case. That was a case that got up to number 1, and 3 things. You know, it's either Kennedy, Manson, or O.J. Simpson.
What's your favorite topic?
What's my favorite topic? The Kennedy case. The Kennedy case, I have to say, and many people have said this before me, is probably the most fascinating story ever told. And that's why more words have been written about the Kennedy case than any other single one-day event in world history. To this very day, people talk about the Kennedy case all over the world. You could get 10 of the best novelists you could find, put them in a room, give them all the time they needed to come up with a presidential assassination as unbelievable and as intriguing as this one. They couldn't come in within 10 light years of it. And that's one reason why I was able to keep my interest in this for 20 years. There are people who devoted their life to this case. It is never ending. It's an unbelievable case. The cast of characters alone would rival anything in Shakespeare. So if you're going to ask me the most fascinating case, obviously, is the Kennedy assassination. With any project that you and I or anyone takes on in life, we know intuitively, without giving it a second thought, we know that if we work long and hard enough, we're going to reach the bottom of the pile, right? Well, I can tell you, and other people will tell you the same thing, there is no bottom to the pile in the Kennedy assassination. It's a bottomless pit. That's not just a casual turn of phrase. There's no end to it. As I'm talking to you right now, there's at least 100 people in this country who are looking at some document from the National Archives for some inconsistency, discrepancy, contradiction, some little hint of a conspiracy. They're consecrating their life to this thing. There's 1,000 other people out there doing the same thing part-time. It is never, ever, ever ending. And I got sucked into the abyss and I couldn't get out because I was responding to all these crazy people all over the country, coming up with these, you know, like the guy that says a Secret Service agent accidentally killed the president. Well, in the book, I have to address myself to it because this is the book of the case, and you got to cover everything. But there's absolutely no end to this case, and I feel that I'm not sure, but I feel it may have taken a physical toll on me. I mean, there were times when I seemed to be going in 4 or 5 directions at the same time, you know, because I don't have a computer. And I'm going this direction, that direction. I remember one time I was at the Pasadena Library, and I felt something coming over me, and I don't know what it was, and I just had to sit down and put my head down. I never had that before. So this case, I'd never met the Kennedy case before. The famed humorist Will Rogers, you've heard of him, way before your time, but anyway, he said, I've never met a man that I didn't like. Well, subsequent to that, when people would meet someone who, in their mind, was particularly reprehensible, they'd say, Will Rogers never met so-and-so. I had never met the Kennedy case before. It's just an incredible, incredible story. Unbelievable. And in writing the book, there were many, many times where I figured, you know, I've covered all the issues. And that evening, I'm not exaggerating, or the next day, something would come in, and it would just say, what the heck is this? And then I'd have to order another 100 documents from the archives and make another 20 phone calls. And it was very exasperating, and it bothered me. But there came a point in time when this would happen. I think I was through, and then something else would come in, where in addition to being exasperated, a slight little smile of amusement would come across my face, because I'd say, you know, this is the Kennedy case. If there's something phenomenal that's indigenous to this case, and I'd almost smile at, well, this is the Kennedy case. It never ends.
You said you don't have a PC. How do you write?
I'm still in the 19th century. I'm going to stretch my leg here.
We're going to take a break in just a minute after this question.
I'm sorry. How do I write?
Tell you what, hold on to that answer. We're going to go ahead and take a break here. Our guest on In Depth is Vincent Bugliosi, author of 11 books. We will be right back after this to continue taking your phone calls and talk with him. We are back live on In Depth with Vincent Bugliosi, and we will be here until 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Mr. Bugliosi, before we went to that break, we were talking about your writing technique. You don't use a computer. How do you write?
I'm still in the 19th century, yellow pad and pencil. I write everything out in longhand. Although not too long ago I graduated from a number 3 to a number 4 pencil, but I'm back to number 2 now. What I do is I write everything down, the first draft, in longhand. Then I dictate into a tape recorder, give it to my secretary. She's not in an adjacent room. I operated out of a converted stall in a garage adjacent to my house, but I send it to her, or I drive up the hill and give it to her, and she types it up, and she sends it back to me. And from that point on, the original draft goes through 5, 10 drafts. And what are these drafts? They're yellow page inserts, you know, and they're endless. So my books usually are books of inserts. The first, well, for instance, the autopsy of the president. That might be 50 pages on the first draft, but it ends up 250 pages. Now, how does it end up 250 pages? That's 200 pages of yellow page inserts that Rosemary Newton, my secretary, has to type up. So that's how I do my books in longhand. And
what do you do with that first draft? Do you save it? Do you have it saved somewhere?
Yeah, I have it. Just stacks and stacks of stuff in my office, yeah.
How long has Rosemary worked for you?
Oh, I think about 10 years, you know. And she deserves a medal because, you know, to follow all my things, see insert 65. Then she goes to insert 65, and that refers to, now go to 10 pages after insert 53. She goes there, and then there's 3 endnotes, and each endnote has got 5 footnotes. And by the time she gets back to the original thing, it's an hour later, and it's just, I'm the architect of the madness. Sometimes she has to straighten things out for me.
You live in L.A.?
Yeah.
And how long have you lived out there?
Since 1957. Yeah, I don't have a computer or a cell phone.
Why?
Pardon?
Why?
Why? Well, I think I have an instinctive disinclination for anything mechanical or technological. Not only because I'm a spastic when it comes to these things, but with anything corporeal, I like simplicity and these modern gadgets that they add to products at the expense of utility. I'm a utilitarian. It bothers me. I want everything simple. When I speak to a jury and I put a bib on them and spoon feed them, you know, you got to be simple. Life is simple for the simple-minded. Maybe it's because I'm simple-minded. I don't know. But I like simplicity. So a computer is just... and I feel that when I'm writing, a lot of times there'll be something in my mind, and I think I know it pretty well, but I can't articulate it. And when I work with that yellow pad, in my mind I can't articulate it, but when I work with that yellow pad, it somehow forces me to articulate. And I have confidence that once I get with the yellow pad, I will be able to articulate it. As far as a cell phone, I don't think I was even aware of cell phones until a couple years ago. I mean, I had heard the word cell phone, but I just wasn't aware of them until several years ago. And I see everyone running around with talking on the phone, and you have to carry them around with you, right? In your pocket?
It helps.
In your pocket, or doesn't it bulge out of the pocket, or what? I don't know. I don't know. I can't see myself carrying around any object with me, you know. So I think that would bother me. But in a way, I feel that, well, people have said, Vince, the world is passing you by. And I don't feel that. But about a year and a half or two ago, something happened within a day or two period that kind of jolted me more than ever before about there's another world out there. I do my research, my legal research, at two law libraries, the Ninth Circuit in Pasadena and then the Downtown Law Library, and most of my research is at the Pasadena Library, and I do research on microfilm and microfiche, hundreds of hours, and then interlibrary loans where they get books from all over the country. And I don't think I can do that on the computer. I got to go to the original source. I don't think the computer would have these things. Anyway, I'm in this library this particular day, and I'm not exaggerating now. I was there for an hour and a half. There wasn't one single person in that library for an hour and a half. I used to go to a law library, and you know, there were a lot of lawyers, law students. Apparently today, I don't know if they subscribe to a service or whatever it is, but they press some button and they got the whole library on their computer. I mean, it's unbelievable.
Doesn't that sound intriguing, though?
Yeah, no, it does. But as I say, there was no one in this library except me for an hour and a half. Even the receptionist. Now, I'm sure there was a receptionist there, probably in an adjacent office. No one in the library for an hour and a half. And that was kind of jolting, you know, because in the old days there was always someone there. Then, either the next day or the day later, and this is what kind of jolted me because there were these two things that happened. I was trying to get this conspiracy book on the assassination. This was about a year and a half or two ago. And I couldn't find it anywhere. So I had an 800 number for Amazon.com, and I called them up. And they said, yeah, we can get the book for you. It's a British book. Take about a couple weeks. And I said, great. You know, and then there was a pause, and I said, let me know when you want my credit card number. My wife has given me a credit card. And he said, we can't take your credit card. And I said, really? I said, that's strange. I said, I've ordered quite a few things over the phone, and I give them my credit card number. He said, no, we can't take a credit card here at Amazon.com. And I said, well, okay. I said, give me your address, and I'll send you a check, you know. And he said, well, we can't take your check here at Amazon.com. I said, you can't take my check? I said, am I supposed to send you cash in the mail? He said, well, no, we don't take cash here at Amazon.com. I said, well, are you playing a joke? How am I supposed to get this book? And he says to me, do you have a computer? And I said, no. He says, well, you have to find someone who has a computer to order the book. So I contacted Rosemary, and she ordered it to me. But this happened within a day or two period, and I said, this is unbelievable, you know, that I can't even order a book by credit card or check. There's nothing in this world, this other world, that I want or need. Nothing. although it's a great world. I'm not denigrating it, but there's nothing that I want or need in this world. However, there may come a time, you know, where I have no choice and I'm going to have to jump aboard. I mean, when you can't even, I mean, are they going to eliminate law libraries? Is everything going to be on a computer? So I don't know. It's but at my age, I just.
Do you have children?
Yeah, 2.
And do they use a computer or a cell phone?
Yeah.
And your wife?
Well, here's the interesting thing. My son's a doctor, and he bought my wife a computer a couple months ago. People used to call me and ask me, what's your email address? Not, do you have any? And I said, I don't have an email address. I said, you don't have an email address? I said, no. You don't have a computer? I said, anyway, he bought her a computer, and now she's got an email address. So if we're coming home, she says she's got to check her email, some yahoo.com or something. So to me, I just chuckle. It's just funny. But I'm not going to get a computer, as far as I know.
Vincent Bugliosi is our guest. We're going to put the numbers up on the screen in case you'd like to participate in this conversation. Kenosha, Wisconsin, you're on the air with Vincent Bugliosi.
Hi, Mr. Bugliosi. I agree with your argument that Oswald acted alone, but there's one thing I don't understand. Why did the United States readmit Oswald after his attempted defection to the Soviet Union, or charge him with treason?
Well, in treason, you have to do something that's against the federal government during the time of war. He did nothing against the government in time of war that was injurious to this country. And why did they readmit him? He was still an American citizen. He didn't renounce his citizenship. He wanted to, but they did not accept him over there. So he was an American citizen, and he was entitled to come back to this country.
Atlantic City, you're on the air.
Would you agree that the U.S. Constitution as is really, if followed as we are, it's really essentially and ultimately going to be a suicide document for us? And what I mean by that is this. We have so many issues and problems that really affect us in this country where the citizens are really hurt and suffer under, like crime, vicious, rampant, bloody crime, drugs, illegal aliens. These problems, these issues seem like out of control, like they can't be solved and will never be solved. And
but,
why?
Caller, what do you mean the Constitution as a suicide document?
Oh, because isn't it true that we all know the Constitution controls us. The Constitution binds us as a nation and a people, and we do follow it. And because we do follow it, we cannot solve our problems, in that anybody, certainly an intelligent man like Mr. Bugliosi, could come up with easy solutions to those 3 problems.
All right. Anything there to work with?
I don't understand what he's saying. The Constitution is American Constitution is a wonderful, wonderful document, and all well-intentioned people follow it. It's a good guideline for us. But I can tell you this. We got 2 right-wing crazies on the Supreme Court, Scalia and Thomas, who are, in my opinion, an embarrassment and a disgrace, not just to the bench, but to the legal profession. We got 2 other right-wingers. We don't know yet whether they're zanies or not. We got 1 moderate Republican. He's fine. And then 4 ordinary people.
Is that Justice Kennedy in your view?
Yeah. So 2 potentially dangerous people, 2 right-wing zanies who are very dangerous, and they're criminals as far as I'm concerned, if we get into Bush v. Gore, and then 4 ordinary people. So it's 5-4. If a case comes in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, I'm just giving you a hypothetical situation, comes in front of the U.S. Supreme Court where the police did not have a search warrant and they had time to get it. If they don't have time to get it, under the exigency, it's urgency exception to the 4th Amendment, they don't need a search warrant. Exigent circumstances. But hypothetically, take a situation where the police go in without a search warrant and they had time, and there's a decision, 5-4, Kennedy goes the wrong way, that this was okay. America would change overnight. But I think the Constitution is a wonderful document. These framers were incredibly prescient, although they needed the Bill of Rights to supplement it. Well, the framers did not produce the Bill of Rights, but when you look at the Bill of Rights, in addition to the Constitution, it's a very powerful, wonderful document. And I don't know what he's talking about when he says it's a suicide thing. It's a thing that we have that really protects our freedoms.
Let's talk about the Betrayal of America. We started to at the beginning of the show and haven't had a chance yet. This is your book about the 2000 election, and you say that the Supreme Court undermined the Constitution and chose our president.
When the court ruled, I think it was December 12th, 2000, that they were going to hand the presidency to George Bush, I, like millions of Americans, were outraged. And when I read the responses in the newspapers from legal scholars, law professors, almost unanimously, Republicans and Democrats, they said this was a politically motivated decision, dishonorable, and I agreed with them up to that point. Where I departed with the critics was when they went on to say that because of what the court had done, they had only lost respect for the court. They lost confidence in the court. And I said, wait a while, folks, wait a while. You mean you can steal a presidential election and your only retribution is that some people don't respect you as much? Lost confidence in you? I mean, that's like telling Timothy McVeigh, you know, Timothy, don't worry, we're not going to hurt you, we're not going to punish you, but you know, Tim, we don't respect you as much anymore. We've lost confidence in you. If indeed that decision was politically motivated, as I believe it was, then it was not based on the law. And if it was not based on the law, that means that these 5 justices, whom I refer to as the felonious 5, deliberately and knowingly nullified the votes of 50 million Americans who voted for Vice President Gore. The stark reality, and I say this with every fiber of my being, is that the institution that Americans trust the most to protect its freedoms and its principles committed one of the very biggest crimes in American history when they stopped that recount down in Florida, took the election away from the American people, and handed it to George Bush. And in a fair and just world, these justices belong behind prison bars as much as any white-collar criminal who ever lived.
If this were a dictatorship, it'd be a heck of a lot easier. Just so long as I'm the dictator.
Let's talk about the Betrayal of America. We started to at the beginning of the show and haven't had a chance yet. This is your book about the 2000 election, and you say that the Supreme Court undermined the Constitution and chose our president.
When the court ruled, I think it was December 12th, 2000, that they were going to hand the presidency to George Bush, I, like millions of Americans, were outraged. And when I read the responses in the newspapers from legal scholars, law professors, almost unanimously, Republicans and Democrats, they said this was a politically motivated decision, dishonorable, and I agreed with them up to that point. Where I departed with the critics was when they went on to say that because of what the court had done, they had only lost respect for the court. They lost confidence in the court. And I said, wait a while, folks, wait a while. You mean you can steal a presidential election and your only retribution is that some people don't respect you as much? Lost confidence in you? I mean, that's like telling Timothy McVeigh, you know, Timothy, don't worry, we're not going to hurt you, we're not going to punish you, but you know, Tim, we don't respect you as much anymore. We've lost confidence in you. If indeed that decision was politically motivated, as I believe it was, then it was not based on the law. And if it was not based on the law, that means that these 5 justices, whom I refer to as the felonious 5, deliberately and knowingly nullified the votes of 50 million Americans who voted for Vice President Gore. The stark reality, and I say this with every fiber of my being, is that the institution that Americans trust the most to protect its freedoms and its principles committed one of the very biggest crimes in American history when they stopped that recount down in Florida, took the election away from the American people, and handed it to George Bush. And in a fair and just world, these justices belong behind prison bars as much as any white-collar criminal who ever lived. So I decided to do an article about it. I get up late in the morning. I get to bed around 2, get up around 9, 9:30, 10. But I got up this morning about 4 in the morning, and I was just in a state of rage. And I scratched out about 2,000 words. These people can't get by with this. They're not going to get by with this. They've got to do something. Stain their legacy, do something. And I knew that the mainstream media, you know, like Time, Newsweek, U.S. News and World Report, they would never publish what I had to say because I was going to call these people criminals who belong behind bars. So I remember I called Victor Navasky, longtime publisher of The Nation. I'd spoken to him once or twice. I didn't really know him. I'd never met him. But I'd heard of him. And I can just about tell you the conversation because I remember it fairly well. I said, Victor, I said, these people cannot get by with this. And my exact words to him was, I want you to step up to the plate, I use those words, and publish this article. And he said, Vince, I'm aboard. He said, try to keep it down to 3,500 words. I said, Victor, I said, I can't even say hello in 3,500 words. I ended up writing about 7,000 words. And to Victor's credit, he published the entire 7,000 words, which was unusual for The Nation. And the editors of The Nation said they had the biggest response to that article, none dare call it treason, in the 136-year history of The Nation. The Nation may be the oldest magazine. It's a very well-respected, liberal magazine. It goes back to the last year of the Civil War, 1865. So because of the response to this article, they asked me to do a book. Of course, I'm working on the Kennedy case, but they said, can you put together a short little book based on the article? So I wrote the Betrayal of America, where I excoriated the Supreme Court justices for what they did. And I want to say this. That book was not ideologically driven. If the Supreme Court had done the very same thing for Al Gore that they did for George Bush, I can give you, whether people want to believe me or not, I have no control over that, I would have written the same identical book. It had nothing to do with being a Republican or a Democrat. It had everything to do with telling the U.S. Supreme Court that they can't get by with saying to the American people, you're not going to pick the president, we are. Now, I don't know, do you know the circumstances surrounding all that, the vote and what Scalia did, the words he used? You know all that. I don't know if you think the audience does. Do you want to get into that?
If you can tell it briefly.
Okay, well, again, we're getting into detail, which is the election was in 2000, and the Florida vote, I think there were close to 6 million votes. 6 million votes. And after the electronic counting, Bush was ahead by 327 votes. This is going way back, but I think it was 327 votes. So the Florida Supreme Court, pursuant to a Florida statute, I think it was 102.166 sub 4 sub c, specifically authorized a manual recount where you have a situation where there's these undervotes. There were 6,000 undervotes. These undervotes are valid votes that for one reason or another the voting machine has not picked up. So under that 102 section of the Florida Election Code, they authorize a manual recount. Okay, the manual, and I'm just summarizing this for you, and again, this is way in the past. I forget all the details, but I think the recount started, I think it was a Saturday, December 9th at 8 o'clock, and it was proceeding well, expeditiously. And at 2 in the afternoon, this outrageous Antonin Scalia, this disgrace to the legal profession, Scalia steps in and halts the recount. And this is what he said. I'm not making it up. You can't make up stuff like this. And this is what he said. I'm going to give you the quote, if I can recall it. He steps in and he said, we got to discontinue this recount because if we continue the recount, it could threaten, I think the word he used was irreparable, it could threaten irreparable harm to George Bush by clouding, there was a word before clouding, I forget what the word is, by starting to cloud or whatever it is, the legitimacy of George Bush's election. So it would threaten irreparable harm to George Bush by clouding the legitimacy of George Bush's election. Did you hear what I just said? What I just said is that even though the election had not yet been decided, this outrageous Scalia was presupposing that Bush had won the election, indeed had a right to win it, and any vote count that showed that Gore had won would threaten the legitimacy of George Bush's presidency. Now, only a criminal on the run and rushed for time in desperation would write something as demented and as embarrassing as that. And my point was that if there was any law on the books, I mean, what Congress would ever have a law on the books saying it's a crime to steal a presidential election? So there was no law for them to violate. But in terms of natural law, which is the protoplasm out of which real law exists, they committed one of the most serious crimes in American history. And if justice means anything in America, a term I've used before, they should have spent the rest of their lives behind bars.
And The Betrayal of America was published by Nation Books. San Diego, you're on with Vincent Bugliosi.
Yes, good afternoon, sir.
Yes, sir.
It's an honor to speak with you.
Yes, sir.
My question is, you had mentioned in the beginning of the show about the drug lords and the use of the drug lords in South America and the use of the death penalty here. And you also mentioned that the law enforcement are prosecuting, that the courts are full of drug cases right now. And my concern now is that maybe the death penalty does not provide a deterrent. If you look at, say, for Texas, Apple has the highest use of the death penalty, but it hasn't really had an impact on crime.
The state of Texas has the highest use of the death penalty, no impact on crime.
Well, that's not exactly true. You know, how many crimes or murders would we have in Texas without the death penalty? These drug lords, they have an option. We're not talking about crimes of passion where people kill and they're not thinking about it. They're thinking, you know, where can I make $1 billion and still survive? And if they can come to this country and still survive, that's not a deterrent. If they come to this country and they know they may end up 6 feet under, they say, hey, maybe we should go elsewhere. So his position is that the death penalty is not a deterrent. I don't agree with that. If we start out with the assumption, and I think it's a reasonable assumption, that the threat of punishment is a deterrent to crime, and I think that's a reasonable premise. If people could rob, rape, and kill with total impunity, I think we all agree there'd be a higher incidence of that type of conduct. I think it necessarily follows, I don't think it's a non sequitur, that the greater the punishment, the greater the crime. And how many beacons of lighthouses at sea have prevented ships from crashing into them? That's something we're never going to know. But in California, for instance, during a period of time when they were imposing the death penalty, there absolutely was a decrease in the number of criminal homicides. And we have on tape where a robber says, I was about to pull the trigger on a liquor store proprietor, and I thought of the gas chamber, and I did not pull the trigger. It doesn't deter everyone, I agree with you, but some people are going to think twice, particularly the drug lords, because this is really, really premeditated. It's not an instantaneous type of thing. But I mean, I see his point. It's not going to deter everyone. You're not going to solve the drug problem, but you can reduce it down to manageable proportions. And if you don't think people want to live, go to death row, okay? You know, people say, well, it's just as bad to keep them behind bars for the rest of their lives. Really? Go to death row and see how many of them want to die. When you find 1 out of 1,000, they make the cover of Time magazine. People want to live. And there's no... Here, I'll show you how much the Colombian drug lords fear the death penalty or even extradition. The Medellin cartel, I don't know if you're aware of this, they were killing defense ministers, judges. They went into the Colombian Supreme Court and killed 12 Supreme Court justices who were about to rule on whether there should be extradition to America. Now, if they didn't want to live, you know, why would they do that? They were killing everyone. I think the term there was plomo de plata or something like that. I forget how you pronounce it, but it was take the bullet or take the silver or the lead. And these Colombian people were good people, and the fact that they ended up in their graves meant they did not take the silver, and they were killing them down there. Killing a tremendous amount of police officers and judges, Supreme Court justices, attorney generals. Why? They didn't want to be extradited to America.
You still sound like a prosecutor, but you've been a defense attorney for 30 years?
No, I haven't been a defense attorney. I've been writing for 30 years. I take a case here and there. I'm still a member of the bar. But most of these people are guilty, and I don't want to defend them. I don't want to defend the very same people I used to send to death row. And again, this is not a matter of ethics. I'm not putting myself up on any pedestal. It's a matter of motivation. If you gave me a choice, if you came to me and you said, Mr. Bugliosi, we got a case here. This defendant is innocent. Big case, big murder case. We want you to defend this person, but you can't write a book on it. Or you don't defend this person, but you can write a book upon it. There would be no choice. I'd go into court. See, whether you're prosecuting a guilty person or defending an innocent person, in both situations you're fighting for justice. And when you write a book, you're not a player. You're writing about what other people are doing. I'd rather be a player. The problem is I'm no longer a prosecutor, and to be a player on the other side, I'd have to start defending these people. My image is still as a prosecutor. No question about that. I mean, wherever I go around the country, people, they think I'm still prosecutor, DA. And at one time I wanted to change my image because I was willing to defend people if they're innocent. And usually I'm the last person in the world anyone in trouble would think of going to because my image is that of being a prosecutor. But there were a couple big cases that came to me and would have changed my image. And I turned them down. One of them was this Jeffrey McDonald case. Do you know about that? He was the captain in the Marines, I think. He was charged with killing his wife and 2 children in Raleigh, North Carolina. Big book was written on it. Joe McGinnis wrote Fatal Vision, a true crime classic. And you don't know about that case? Fatal Vision, very, very fine book. And he was working in the emergency department down in Long Beach. He was a doctor. And his girlfriend, or what have you, came to my office and said he was about to be re-indicted and wanted to know if I would defend him. And I said, well, you know, I prosecute murderers. I don't defend them. And I said, but if he's innocent, you know, I'd certainly be interested. I said, but he's going to have to take a polygraph test first and pass it. And she said, well, I'm sure there won't be any problem. So she left the office. And I remember I called back. He spoke to the prosecutor. He wasn't too revealing about what he had, but he did tell me something that really told me all I wanted to know. 2-year-old baby girl had embedded in her fingernails blue threads from McDonald's pajamas which conjured up the idea in my mind of, Daddy, Daddy, you know, don't do this. I remember telling my wife about it, Gail, and she started crying. And certainly I wasn't interested at that point. And then she called me back about a week later, and she said that Dr. McDonald doesn't see any reason why, as a condition to your representing him, that he's got to pass a lie detector test. And he ended up being convicted of 3 murders. Now, that would have been a big case for me, but I'd had to try to get, in my opinion, a murderer off. Dan White, have you ever heard of him? He was a supervisor in San Francisco, and he murdered the mayor.
Sure.
And 2 supervisors.
The Twinkie,
he used to be a former police officer, and they contacted me, the fellow members of the police department wanted me to defend him. I mean, he climbed through a window at City Hall with a gun and killed him. I didn't take that case either. But no, I would like to defend people if they're innocent, if it's a serious crime, you know, a murder, because you're fighting for justice. But there aren't too many of those people out there. And so I'm still a member of the bar, but I write full-time, 7 days a week. As I say, I'm working on a book deadline right now that I have to get in by the end of next month.
Henderson, Minnesota, thanks for holding. You're on with Vincent Bugliosi.
Thank you. Twice you've mentioned that the Kennedy assassination was the biggest murder in American history. Why do you think the Kennedy assassination is bigger than the Lincoln assassination?
Well, certainly there were more people around at the time of the Kennedy assassination, and I'm not demeaning the Lincoln assassination. It was absolutely enormous. But I think most people feel that the Kennedy case altered the course of world history. No one has suggested that about the Lincoln assassination. Well, I mean, the Vietnam War itself probably would not have happened if Kennedy had become president. And, you know, he was starting to withdraw troops, as you well know. And we don't know exactly what he would have happened, because that's lost to history. He still could have gone to war there, but everyone agrees he did not want to go to war, and he started withdrawing troops. And the Vietnam War, with its cataclysmic consequences that resonate to this very day, came as a result of the Kennedy assassination. So it's just a bigger case, and I'm not saying that the Lincoln assassination was not a big case, but I don't think it had an effect on history. His Emancipation Proclamation was before his assassination. But that's a good question. More people mourned President Kennedy's death, they say, than the death of any other human in history. Only one country did not mourn his death, and that was China. But throughout the world, I mean, in America, over 50% of the American people literally had not felt like crying, literally had tears in their eyes. There were torch-lit parades in all the great capitals of the world, hundreds of thousands of people. And you know, John F. Kennedy was a very special guy. One of the interesting little quotes, he used his father's influence. You know, George Bush used his father's influence to run away from the Vietnam War. But, you know, there was a problem, possible invasion from Oklahoma to Texas, so he had to get down there and be ready for that invasion. But he used his father's influence to avoid fighting when it was his generation's time to fight. But he has no problem with sending other people to war, the children of other Americans, to shed their blood for his war. Anyway, what am I talking about now again? You're not listening to me. Okay.
I am trying my darndest.
Okay.
You are going everywhere.
Yeah, I know, and I go off on these fringes.
No, but I want this next call. That was the Kennedy-Lincoln assassination call we just took.
Yeah.
And I swear to God, I followed you as far as I could.
Here's what I was going to say. Here's what I'm going to say about Kennedy, and it was one of the most important things. What I was going to say is that he gets into the war, and his lieutenant commander, here's where I went off on the tangent. When I was younger, you know, I could go off on tangent and go right back, but now I can't. His lieutenant commander writes home, and he said, you know, honey, we got this young Jack Kennedy in our unit. Now, he wasn't famous then. His father, Joe Kennedy, was ambassador to England. he said, and he's the only guy in the Navy who's faking good health. So here's a guy who used his father's influence to get into that war, to get a phony medical certificate because he was ill all of his life. And he became a war hero, a tremendous war hero. Everyone liked John F. Kennedy. Not Bobby. A lot of people loved Bobby, but a lot of people did not. He was ruthless, they said. But Jack, everyone loved, even his opponents, they respected John F. Kennedy. And one of the most interesting things to me that really hit home about John F. Kennedy, the fellow that wrote The Grapes of Wrath, Steinbeck. Yeah. I don't read fiction, by the way. I can't even read the first paragraph. Anything that I know didn't happen, I just can't read. Anyway, Steinbeck's in Warsaw, Poland, on a cultural mission for the State Department at the time of the assassination. And he writes back, and he said, "I've never seen such mourning in all of my life." Now, this is in an Iron Curtain country. And he said, the people of Poland have never seen such mourning for the death of anyone. Now, when you stop to think about it, this is at the height of the Cold War. The people are living in a bubble. Everything is censored. How much could they have seen Kennedy, heard his voice, or heard what he had to say? Because they only heard what the Kremlin wanted them to hear. And charisma, he had a tremendous amount of charisma. Nellie Connolly was married to Governor Connolly, a charismatic guy. But Nellie Connolly said, you know, I thought I knew what charisma was until I met John F. Kennedy. But charisma only takes you so far. It lassos you, but there's got to be something more. And there must have been something about Kennedy's facial expression or the tone of his voice that penetrated that Iron Curtain and reached the hearts of the people, and they took his death harder than the death of anyone, even in Poland. Russia took his death hard throughout the entire world. So he was a very special person, John F. Kennedy.
Miami, thanks for holding. You're on.
Hi, thanks. An observation and a question. The observation is that when you talked about the Supreme Court and the decision that they made in the Gore case, the Constitution actually does prevent the Supreme Court from involving itself in political questions, which I think that would have qualified. But the question I have for you is, given the quality of the judiciary in the United States today, which I think you must know as well as I do, that it is declining exponentially. The level of intellectual integrity in the judicial process is being lost. If it ever existed, it certainly doesn't exist anymore. The fact that the judiciary did not scream out when the Supreme Court made a decision that was so intellectually dishonest, and more importantly, didn't point out the fact that it was an illegal decision when in fact...
Paul, are you still with us?
Yeah, I'm still with you.
All right,
so
go ahead and
I'd appreciate your comment.
Well, I'm not sure what your question was. It's always been the case that you get a judicial appointment normally because you're close to the governor or the president, or you're close to someone who is close to them. So it's a political appointment. As far as the illegality of the court's ruling, it was illegal. There's no question about it. Now, let me try to summarize it for you. They based their ruling on a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And here's what they said. The various Florida counties had different techniques or different means of determining voters' intent, okay? Different ways. So the Supreme Court, and I'm going to demonstrate to you how bogus it is. There's many, many reasons. I'm going to give you a couple of them. They said, well, the problem is that some of these undervotes in some counties might be disqualified, and in another county they would qualify. So that's a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment because of these different standards that the various counties had. Now, if the court was so concerned about these undervoters, as they so fervently claim to be, why would they, in effect, then say, we're so concerned that some of you undervoters may lose your votes because of the different standards, that we're going to solve the problem by making sure that none of your votes are going to be counted? Is that what you do when you're trying to help people? We're going to make sure that none of you undervoters are going to have your votes counted. Number two, law professors, legal scholars around the country overwhelmingly said this was a dishonorable, politically motivated ruling. Number three, there's probably 7 or 8, but I'm going to give you a couple, and then I'm going to give you the main reason. Number three, if they had followed their own legal precedent, fundamental legal principles, they would know Scalia himself has articulated these very words. You do not have a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment unless the discrimination is, quote, intentional or, quote, purposeful, okay? It's got to be intentional. We're to believe that these canvassing boards in these various Florida counties, when they were coming up with their own way, their own standards to determine votes, were intentionally trying to discriminate against the voters of other counties. That's preposterous. Now let me give you as close to a confession as I can give you of what these criminals were up to. They're not going to confess, but I'm going to give you something as close to a confession as you're going to get in this case. Again, Scalia himself has said, and it's well known, the primary function of the United States Supreme Court is to set legal precedent, to set forth principles of law that the courts throughout the land have to follow. That's why they're there, to establish legal precedent. Now let me tell you what they did, which is tantamount to a confession, and which tells all reasonable people that their ruling only had one objective, and that objective was to put their guy in the Oval Office. For the first time in the 210-year history of the court, first time ever, their ruling on equal protection, they said, was, quote, limited, unquote, to the case before them. Are you listening to what I'm saying here now? For the first time in 210 years, they were not establishing legal precedent. They said their ruling was limited to this case in front of them. Now why? Well, because they knew that if they were establishing legal precedent, as they had been doing for 210 years, it would set aside elections throughout the entire country. Because the various states all have different methods of counting votes, even different methods of voting. And they certainly didn't want to set elections aside throughout the country. So they had the unmitigated gall. I mean, they took audacity to symphonic and operatic levels. They said, we're going to limit this ruling to this case, because they knew it was a bogus ruling. So it was unlawful. And you know the bad thing about it, what's scary about it, is they got by with it. Everyone was outraged at the time. A week later, you know, Sandra O'Connor's in Scottsdale, Arizona, shot a hole-in-one talking about that. They forgot about it. This monstrous, grotesque Ken Starr sets up an office in Washington, D.C. to destroy the President of the United States over consensual sexual activity. And he got by with it. That's the scary thing. He got by with it. Federally funded, 7 years, $70 million. And he got by with it. Bush has taken this nation to war against an enemy, not an enemy, against an opposition, a country that was not our enemy, against a country that was as much of a threat to the security of this country as an aunt that I have who lives up in Minnesota. And he has gotten by with it up to this point. What type of a country do we have anymore? These are 3 things that I've just told you that would not happen over in Europe. Not even one of them would happen. Do we have a great country anymore? I don't think so. If you want to measure greatness by power and wealth, yes, we're still number one. But when countries around the world, the citizens of other countries said the America is a great country, they weren't talking about power and wealth. They were talking about what this country stood for. And as you know now, since the 8 years of Bush, the majority of citizens around this country look down on America. And yet, to me, I still feel, I can't tell you why, that there's something special about America. Something in our roots and our genes that we can recapture the greatness that we once knew. But right now, when you can have, as I say, Ken Starr in a Supreme Court stealing an election and Bush going to war with a nation not our enemy and not a threat to the security of this country and getting by with it, under what theory? The willy-nilly theory? Do you still call this country a great country?
Where were you born?
Hibbing, Minnesota.
Why?
Why was I born there? Why was I born in Hibbing? Well, my parents were living there, you know.
What did they do?
They were Italian immigrants, hard-working Italian immigrants, a traditional family life. My father worked in the iron ore mines up there, eventually a grocery store. Mother worked in the kitchen, keeping an immaculate home, raising 5 children. So I grew up in Hibbing, Minnesota, a typical kid. There was no crime there. The big crime when you grew up in Hibbing is stealing apples from someone else's tree. There was a wall there. I played all the sports, but there was a wall there in the Memorial Building, and I started hitting against that wall playing tennis. And I had played all the sports, but tennis is the average American kid with average athletic ability. He can play baseball, basketball, football. He doesn't have to have any lessons or anything like that. But tennis, no. It's not a natural sport. I tried to get a point off that wall. I could never get a point off it, but I got pretty steady. And I ended up winning the Minnesota State High School Tennis Championship, and I ended up going to the University of Miami on a partial tennis scholarship. But Hibbing is an unusual little town. There have been articles written about it because it's only 16,000 people. And some pretty prominent people have come from Hibbing, and they've written articles about this. What is it about it? And it's just a coincidence. Kevin McHale, you heard that name?
Yes.
Yeah, Kevin McHale was named one of the top 50 basketball players of the last half century. Unfortunately for Kevin, he played in the shadow of Larry Bird, who was one of the greatest players of all time. But Kevin is from Hibbing. And Kevin told someone, he said, Vince Bugliosi only makes the utility team of the Hibbing Hall of Fame. I forget all the important people in Hibbing, but Bob Dylan is from Hibbing. I mean, I've gone to towns, driven into towns of 250,000 people, and you see a sign on the road saying the hometown of so-and-so was a member of some soap opera. 100,000, 250,000 people. Here's this little dinky town of 16,000 people. Kevin McHale's from there. Bob Dylan and a couple other. Roger Maris, the guy that broke Babe Ruth's record, is from Hibbing, Minnesota. He grew up in Fargo, North Dakota, but he's from Hibbing. So it's a little town, and snows all the time up there. We've had 50 below zero. Great little town.
And again, I might have missed this. Where did you go to law school?
UCLA.
All right. Well, we have about 40 minutes left with our guest, Vincent Bugliosi, and the callers who are on the line. If you can hang on, we will be right back. We are back live with Vincent Bugliosi for our final 30 minutes on In Depth on this Sunday. Mr. Bugliosi, as a prosecutor and a trial attorney, is there an actor element in that, playing to the jury, drama, etc.?
Well, people that have seen me in front of a jury feel that I'm very expressive. They've asked me if I've had acting lessons. I haven't. The main thing is you have to be natural in front of a jury. Because if you're not natural, they'll pick it up just like that, you know. But yeah, if you're trying to make a point, sell a point, you've got to be somewhat dramatic. If you're just sitting there like a potted plant, and that's not going to convince too many people, you know. So you got to be forceful and stuff like that. There's different ways to convince a jury, but I'm kind of dramatic. On direct examination, I'm trying to force into that record. I let the witness be the star. I'm trying to force into that record the evidence that I've already decided that I need to convict this defendant. On cross-examination and final summation, I'm apt to roam every foot of the courtroom floor, and I become much more a part of the
Do you do that on purpose?
Courtroom drama. No, it's just natural. It's just instinctive on my part. But a lawyer cannot convince a jury of his cause, of the rightness of his cause, unless they feel that he believes in it completely himself. If they sense that he does not believe in it completely himself, then he's in trouble. So he's either got, using your term, he's either got to be natural about it or he's got to be a good actor and convince the jury that he believes in his cause.
In all your biomaterials, it says that you won 105 of 106 convictions in L.A. County. What was the one you didn't win?
Well, I won 105 out of 106 felony jury trials. I lost some court trials. That's when you submit it on the transcript and everything. But usually prosecutors don't count those. Felony jury trials. The one I lost was a burglary case, if I recall. Either the guy was innocent or I didn't meet my burden of proof. You know, and people said, geez, that's an incredible conviction rate. And I said, wait a while, these people were all guilty. You know, I wasn't convicting innocent people. Now, if I had convicted 105 out of 106 innocent people, you'd say, hey, this guy's a heck of a prosecutor. But these were all guilty people, and they should have been convicted, so I didn't do anything special. And when the conviction rate's down to 72 or 75 or 80%, it's not because the other 25% of these defendants are innocent. It's because the prosecutor didn't do his job or the police didn't do their job. But I put an enormous amount of research into my case. I mean, I work 7 days a week, 100 hours a week sometimes.
Do you have any hobbies?
Well, tennis used to be a hobby, but I haven't played tennis for 3 years. I just don't have any time.
It's just all writing.
Writing, you know, I put together this album of Latin music. You know about that?
We did want to ask you, we're going to kind of conclude with this. People who wouldn't believe this, here's the CD cover of Vincent Bugliosi presents Greatest Latin Love Songs of the Century. And we have your favorite, I think, that we can play as you answer. Tell us why you put this together. Besame Mucho is your favorite.
I didn't say it was my favorite. No, I love all these songs, yeah. Well, there's all types of Latin rhythms, of course. But to me, the most beautiful are your romantic ballads, the boleros. They've been exported all over the world. Your rancheras and music like that, it's kind of indigenous. But boleros, are they playing it now?
Yeah. Whose idea was this?
It was my idea.
It was your idea.
Yeah.
Okay.
But listen, don't worry, I'm not singing on it, so don't worry about it. Look, there's some great voices on here, Mario Lanza, Placido Domingo, and stuff like that. It's a labor of love. It took me years to put together. What I wanted to do is get the best recordings. That's the key word, the best recordings of these great Latin love songs. But as I'm talking to you right now, probably in a Tokyo elevator or Berlin restaurant, they're playing these songs. Extremely popular music to this very day. The bolero originated in Cuba in the late 1900s, but it found its most prolific expression in Mexico. Most of the songs were written in the 20s, 30s, and the 40s, and they're popular to this very day. You mentioned Besame Mucho. The composer of Besame Mucho died a couple years ago, and in her obituary it mentioned the hundreds of artists around the world, including the Beatles, that had recorded that song. And American standards usually are not recorded all over the world, but this is great, great music. I heard it as a kid, and I loved it. I love the music.
Let's take some calls. Parksville, Oklahoma, you are on with Vincent Bugliosi.
Peter, good afternoon. I hope you're doing fine. It's nice to be able to have some serious discourse here. Couple questions, sir, if I may. First off, McDonald was a Green Beret guy.
Right.
And, of course, the Europeans, when they need our youngins' blood spilled on their territory to bail them out or our money, they'll love us again, so don't really worry about that. Sir, in 1968, I read Helter Skelter originally when it first came out, enjoyed it. When I was in South America, courtesy of Uncle Sam's Misguided Children after a tour in Nam, I happened to be there when Che Guevara was killed, and I knew the real circumstances. And just a couple of weeks ago in our local Providence, the Tulsa World, they had the book, different books coming out, and it talked about an author who has finally told the real truth about Che Guevara and how he died. That in reality he was your typical rich kid who wanted to own his own country, like Fidel Castro. And
so, caller, where are you going with all this?
Pardon, sir?
Where are you going with all this?
Well, the dearth or lack of truth in the media to be able to find the true circumstances on any situation. He wrote Helter Skelter in response to all the facts of all these misguided facts and notions on the Manson murders. And it's, to me, I've even suggested to Brian once on the Journal that a program should be devoted to the dearth or lack of places to find out the real truth or real circumstances.
Thank you. Let's leave it there. Mr. Bugliosi, have you had that experience before or since you wrote Helter Skelter, what you say is to set the record straight? Have you again seen instances where the record has not been straight?
There really hasn't been any book after Helter Skelter that's really attacked the book. It's pretty factual. He's got Che Guevara totally confused. Guevara was not trying to own a country. He picked the last person in the world to make that charge against. Guevara owned Cuba with Castro, as you well know. Even to this very day, he's the big icon back there. You go to the museums down there commemorating the Cuban Revolution. There's more on Guevara than on Castro. I haven't been to Cuba, but on billboards everywhere it's Guevara, Guevara, Guevara. And when he and Castro succeeded in the Cuban Revolution, the country was Guevara's. He could have had anything in the world that he wanted. And he took off because for Castro, Havana was the end of the road. For Guevara, it was just a laboratory, the Cuban Revolution, to try to bring justice to small people, disadvantaged people from around the world, and he died in the Bolivian jungles. The general consensus about Guevara is very, very positive. Bobby Kennedy hated Castro, loved Che Guevara. So where this guy thinks that Che Guevara was out to make money or own a country, the evidence is overwhelming, sir, that you are 100% wrong. He was trying to fight for the little guy. He was willing to give up his life. Give up his life for the little guy.
Wayne, New Jersey.
Yeah, I have a question about the Warren Commission. I've seen documentaries about the assassination that had seemingly credible witnesses whose testimony would have perhaps altered the opinion of the Warren Commission, but they weren't included in the report because the accusation was that the Warren Commission was told what the outcome of the report was to be, and this would have contradicted it.
Well, Mr. Bugliosi, if I could make that a little broader of a question. When you talk to people, when you talk about this book, when people see you, what are the topics that they want to talk about most when it comes to reclaiming history in the Kennedy assassination?
Well, it's not what this fellow claims, because what this fellow claims is that these distinguished, honorable men like Chief Justice Earl Warren got together in a back room and said, let's suppress the truth of American people, being accessories after the fact to murder, which is just preposterous on its face. There's no evidence of it. What do people want to talk to me about most? I'm sorry about my voice. It's been kind of foggy the last several months. I don't know why. Well, there's several key things that Americans want to talk about. One of them certainly is the head snap to the rear. Do you know about the head snap to the rear? If you look at the Zapruder film, that's Abraham Zapruder, amateur photographer, 8mm film, the only film of the assassination. At the time of the headshot that killed the president, you see the president's head snap backwards about 8 inches. That was first shown in 1975. I think it was a Geraldo Rivera show, Good Night America. It was on ABC. Millions saw it for the first time. Life magazine had owned it. It was a pirated copy and it was shown on ABC. And millions of Americans, that's what they were talking about over the water cooler in the morning. The shot indicated that it must have come from the front where the famous grassy knoll was, as opposed to the right rear where Oswald was supposed to have been in the book depository building. Ergo, a conspiracy. If the shot comes from the grassy knoll, it's a conspiracy, because Oswald's back here. And at the trial in London, Jerry Spence, who many people feel is this generation's Clarence Darrow, he showed that segment of Zapruder film about 5 times. And I didn't object. And he said it looked like the president's head had been struck by a bat from the front, swung by Babe Ruth. And he said, Mr. Bugliosi's trying to convince you folks that what you saw with your very own eyes never happened. Now, if I never had an answer to that for the London jury, I think the verdict would have been not guilty, because that would have created a reasonable doubt. And as you know, the jury convicted Oswald. Here's the answer to that question. If you look at the individual frames of the Zapruder film, you can't see it if you look at the film itself. You cannot see it. You've got to look at the individual frames, which I showed on the screen for the Dallas jury. At frame 312, and by the way, for whatever reason, these frames are only in Reclaiming History. They're in the 18th volume of the Warren Commission volume, but for whatever reason, the conspiracy books and the other books don't have these 2 frames, but this book does. If you look at frame 312 of the Zapruder film, the president's head is okay. At frame 313, which is 1/18 of a second later, there's 18.3 frames per second on the Zapruder film. In what direction, 313, you see the explosion to the head, that's when he's hit. In what direction is the president's head pushed? It's pushed slightly forward at frame 313, indicating what? A shot from the rear where Oswald was, not a shot from the front. So at the all-important moment of impact, the president's head is pushed forward, indicating a shot from the rear where Oswald was. And then at frames 314 to 321, you see this violent head snap to the rear, which the pathologists have said was a neuromuscular reaction, i.e., nerve damage caused by the bullet entering the president's brain caused his back muscles to tighten, which in turn caused the head snap to the rear. So the head snap to the rear is certainly one of the big issues. The magic bullet, I'm asked about it all the time. That exemplifies clearly what these conspiracy theorists have done. They are so outrageous that they lie not only when there's and I've never seen any other major event in world history that is shrouded with so much intentional misinformation. They lie not only when there is a document categorically refuting what they say, they even lie when there's a photograph or a film refuting it. Why? Because they know their target audience, maybe only 1 out of 100 has access to this film or photograph. What they do in the Magic Bullet, and I show in the book, they're sketches. They put Governor Connally seated directly in front of Kennedy in the presidential limousine, directly in front. And they say a shot coming from where Oswald was, the right rear, passing through soft tissue in the president's body. That's the first shot, not the head shot. To hit Connally, they say, would have to make a right turn in midair and then make a left turn to go on and hit Connally. And they say bullets don't even do that in cartoons, and everyone starts to laugh, okay? In London, Spence asked his pathologist, Dr. Cyril Wecht, he was a coroner of Allegheny County at the time, he said, Mr. Wecht, why don't you categorize this bullet for the jury? He says, well, Mr. Spence, it was a magic bullet. Bullets don't make right and left turns in midair. So in cross-examination, I said to Dr. Wecht, I said, no, Dr. Wecht, I said, if this bullet passing from right to left on a downward trajectory through the president's body, through soft tissue, which you agree on, if it did not go on to hit Governor Connally, I said, why didn't it tear up the interior of the limousine or hit the driver or anything else? He says, Mr. Bugliosi, I don't know why. I didn't conduct the investigation in this case, Mr. Bugliosi. And I said, now, wait a while, Dr. Wecht, wait a while. I said, the prosecution, and I said it in a derisive way, the jury knew it, the prosecution has its magic bullet. But I said, now apparently you have your own magic bullet. I said, if the bullet passing through soft tissue on a straight line did not hit Governor Connolly after it exited the president's throat, did not tear up the interior of the limousine, did not hit the driver, I said, it must have zigzagged to the left. He said, no, it need not have zigzagged to the left. I said, well, did it hop, skip, and jump over the car? He said, no, it need not have performed any remarkable feat at all. I said, well, then, Dr. Weck, I want you to tell this jury, once that bullet exited the president's throat, what happened to that bullet? And he said, I don't know. So if we listen to the conspiracy theorists, apparently this bullet that exited the president's throat vanished into thin air without a trace. They've got the magic bullet. And they've hung that magic bullet appellation around the Warren Commission for 44 years, and we found out that it is they who have the magic bullet, not the Warren Commission. What other questions am I asked? Why did Ruby kill Oswald? I hear that all the time. Why did he do that, Mr. Bugliosi? You know, I don't think you know what's going on here. He was a hitman for the mob. You know, when you say that Ruby killed Oswald for the mob, people don't realize, by definition, you're saying that Oswald killed Kennedy for the mob. If Oswald didn't kill Kennedy for the mob, why would they have to silence him? So it presupposes that Oswald killed Kennedy for the mob, and there's no evidence of that. Ruby was examined in great depth, and all of his family and everyone, by the FBI, the Warren Commission. They found no evidence that he was ever connected to the mob. But, you know, he came from the streets of Chicago at the time of Al Capone. He'd wear a fedora hat. He was always trying to create the impression that he had mob connections. And he had these two nightclubs, one of which was a girly club, the Carousel. And undoubtedly, he came into contact with some low-level mobsters, but no more than anyone would be expected to do in the position that he was in. He took a polygraph test, wanted to take a polygraph test, and passed on that issue. He'd be one of the last people again. You know, we're talking about two small men here. Oswald killing Kennedy, Ruby killing Oswald, both wanting to become big, and they both succeeded. But he'd be the last guy they'd ever go to. Number one, he was very close to Dallas law enforcement. He used to hang out at the Dallas Police Department. Had many, many close friends, Ruby did, on the Dallas Police Department. And he was a snitch. Anything smacking of criminality at the club, he'd call the Dallas Police Department. Type of guy you'd want to be a hitman for you. He also had some very severe emotional problems, violent temper. People would be talking to him at the Carousel Club. All of a sudden, he knocks them down, throws them down the steps. He had organic brain damage, 7 dogs, 6 of whom he called his children. The 7th, Sheba, was his wife. There's a guy by the name of Jack Revelle. Jack Revelle was the head of the Dallas Police Department's intelligence section. And he testified before the House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1978. He said, let me tell you something. I know Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby was a buffoon. And I say this to this committee. He says, if Jack Ruby was a member of organized crime, then the personnel director of organized crime should be replaced. Isn't it funny that everyone that knew Jack Ruby, they laugh at the suggestion that he was a big-time mobster. But some, talking about a computer, some young kid in Dubuque, Iowa is on his computer and he's looking at these documents and he's convinced that Ruby was this big-time mobster, member of the mob. Why did Ruby kill Oswald? I think we know why. Ruby loved President Kennedy, idolized him, thought he was the greatest man who ever lived, and took the president's death very hard. His sister Eva used to live in L.A. She's passed on. And I used to talk to Eva from time to time. And she says, you know, when my brother Jack, at the time of the assassination, when President Kennedy died, she said, my brother Jack cried harder than when Ma and Pa died. And he had all this animus for Kennedy, for Oswald, as many, many people did. And he said, when they subdued him after the shot, he said, well, someone had to kill that son of a blank. He said, and you guys couldn't do it. So I think there was a lot of hatred involved there. Also, something I didn't know until I got into the case, Jack thought he was going to become a hero. just about everyone that knew Jack said, yeah, he always wanted to become a hero, you know, and he thought he was going to become a hero because he's killing the guy who killed the president. The prosecutor of Ruby, you know, he was prosecuted and sentenced to death. Bill Alexander, I've gotten to know Bill fairly well. He says, yeah, Jack thought he was going to become a hero. Several members of the jury that convicted him said he thought he was going to become a hero. And we know that from his jail cell, he was sending out messages. He wanted an agent. He thought there was going to be a big book, a big movie. His lawyer, first lawyer, said, yeah, Jack thought he was going to get a slap on the wrist, and in due time he'd be back at the carousel shaking the hands of people from around the world who wanted to shake the hand of the guy who killed the man who killed the president. He was going to be greeting them at the carousel. So I think we know that, and in fact, by the way, he did get telegrams from around the world say, Jack, you're a hero, I want to kiss your feet, you should get a medal for killing Oswald. So I think we just about know why he did it. Another question that I always get is, why did Oswald kill Kennedy? Now, this book here, it had always been the conventional wisdom, even among people who believed that Oswald killed Kennedy and acted alone, even among those people, it had always been the conventional wisdom that there would never be a satisfactory resolution to this case. There would always be some mystery. It may sound presumptuous. Reclaiming history removes all doubt, settles all questions about the assassination once and for all. And the general consensus of the majority of people who have read this book agree. Many people have told me, like Gary Getzman, who's Tom Hanks' partner, he said, Vince, he says, you know, he said, I was embarrassed when I read the book to think that I thought that there was a conspiracy in this case. Again, what are I'm closing on what issue? On the issue of,
why Oswald killed Kennedy.
Yeah, right. Well, what I was going to say is this. That's one thing that this book cannot tell you. Oswald is dead. Even if he were alive, he might not be able to tell us the dynamics swirling around in his fevered brain which caused him to do this monstrous act of murder. But we have certain evidence from which we can draw evidence or inferences. I'll just mention a couple of them to you. Number one, Oswald had delusions of grandeur. His diary was called the Historic Diary. Squad mate of his in the Marines said, you know, I know Oswald, and he wanted to do something that 10,000 years from now people would still be talking about. His wife Marina, whom I've met, feisty gal. Anyway, she said that he compared himself with the great figures of history. He was a dyslexic, but he read very voraciously. He compared himself with the great figures of history that he read about in their biographies. Getting a little bit more specific, he revered Fidel Castro. I think I've touched on that. And strong supporter of the Cuban Revolution. He was against Kennedy's, obviously, his support of the Bay of Pigs invasion. And I agree with the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee that by killing Kennedy, he was killing an opponent of Castro and therefore furthering the Cuban Revolution. But there was something else that I came upon which is tied in to the Manson case to a certain degree, and I offered to the jury in London, put it on their plate for their consideration, because we don't know why. And by the way, a prosecutor never has to prove why someone killed someone. I mean, I put people on death row without knowing why they did it. All I knew is that they killed the victim and they had no legal justification for doing it. The jury would like to know why, but you don't have to prove motive. Manson never knew the identity of the people whom he was having his minions kill, but he knew they were white, they were members of the establishment. He had an enormous hostility toward the establishment, so these people were representatives of the establishment, and he had this tremendous hostility for them. So it was a representative type killing. He didn't know the identity, but they were representatives of an establishment that he hated. Oswald did not hate President Kennedy. There were certain things he had done he didn't like, Bay of Pigs, but he liked his proposed civil rights legislation. And Spence argued that in London. Why would he kill Kennedy when there's no evidence that he really hated Kennedy? Well, I put on some evidence that he wasn't happy with President Kennedy, but he did not hate him. And Marina said that he kind of liked President Kennedy. So why in the world would he kill Kennedy? And my background in the Manson case probably was responsible for something that leapt, is that the way you pronounce the word, leapt, L-E-P-T, leapt off the page to me, perhaps more than the average person. I was reading his diary, Oswald's diary, in preparation for the London trial. And he's talking about living under communism and capitalism. And he said, quote, these are his exact words. He says, I despise, that's a motive, I despise the representatives of both systems. And that word representatives leapt off the page to me. And I argued to the jury, I said, we don't know why Oswald did it. We know he did it, we don't know why. But I said he may have used or may have viewed President Kennedy is the quintessential representative of a society for which he held a grinding contempt. And when he was aiming at the President of the United States and shooting the President of the United States, he was aiming and shooting the United States of America.
You mentioned Charles Manson. When's the last time you had contact with him?
He's written me a total of 4 letters years ago. One of them, I chuckled a little bit because he seemed to be angry that I had not responded to his first letter. I don't know if he thought we were going to become pen pals or whatever it was, but I just turned them over to the Department of Corrections. Manson is very intelligent. You have to be to speak in riddles. People hear him say things, and what's he saying? And then you type it up, and there's some underlying message. And there were some underlying messages in what he said to me. Although one letter was so garbled up, I told my wife, I said, maybe I was just joking, maybe Manson is insane. He's not insane, by the way. Well, he's insane the way Hitler was insane. Let's not confuse having warped moral values with insanity. He knew exactly what he was doing. A very evil person, a very sophisticated, evil con man, a cold-blooded killer who cleverly masqueraded behind the common image of being a hippie, but very intelligent. And anyone who knows Manson will tell you he's very, very intelligent. Charismatic personality. Not in our world. We'd ignore him. But he didn't move in our world. He moved in the offbeat, dropout world of the hippie. And in that world, the evidence is very clear. Wherever he went, kids just seemed to gravitate around him. And he didn't have to get up in an orange crate and start screaming to get attention. They just seemed to follow him. But he's a complex individual. By his own admission, he said, I'm a man of 1,000 faces. Very bright, like I said, pseudo-philosopher, a frustrated singer-guitarist, a megalomaniac. Someone who knew Manson a lot better than I did because he lived with him, little Paul Watkins. Paul's dead now. He said, Vince, he says, death is Charlie's trip. And he had a passion for death, blood, and murder. I don't know if you know, but there was their plan to start traveling throughout the country, ripping off families in small American towns. And they also had plans to murder Frank Sinatra, Liz Taylor, Richard Burton, Steve McQueen, Tom Jones. So their lifestyle, their religion was murder. They enjoyed killing. And I just felt that if this guy wasn't taken off the street, he was going to continue to kill.
How often in your life have you been under protection because of your work?
Well, I had bodyguards during that time. Yeah.
Is that the only time?
Yeah.
Okay. Time for one more call, and I apologize. You've been on the line for a long time. Fort Worth, Texas. You're on the air.
Hello. Yeah, this is. It has been a long time. This is about the Kennedy case. In a book I have called Oswald's Tale by Norman Mailer, he says that George de Mohrenschildt was a CIA operative who was Oswald's good friend and loaned him the money to buy the gun he used to kill Kennedy.
Who wrote the book again, caller?
Norman Mailer.
Are you familiar with this, Mr. Bugliosi?
Yeah. You should ask Norman Mailer if he has any citation for that. He has no citations in the book that I know of. He certainly has no citation for that. George de Mohrenschildt was examined very, very closely by the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee. He was not a CIA operative. That's nonsense. But he did do this, and this was not a clandestine activity. This was non-clandestine. De Mohrenschildt traveled around the world, and when he came back, they had their domestic intelligence division of the CIA, and they'd interview people who were coming back from business trips around the world to give them information about what's going on in Estonia, Yugoslavia. No, he was not a CIA operative, and there's no evidence that he gave Oswald any money to buy that. How much money did he have to give him? It cost $12.
After you finish your book on President Bush, which is due out in May, do you have another project in mind?
If something gets me mad, I will, and I seem to be angry all the time, but I don't have anything. I've written a series of essays that I may put into a book on androgenization movement in our society, agnosticism. I'm an agnostic. I like Clarence Darrow's statement that I don't purport to know what ignorant men are sure of.
Well, here are some of Mr. Bugliosi's books. Of his 11 books, we wanted to show you quite a few of those. Till Death Do Us Part, Real Crime Story, Outrage, The 5 Reasons Why O.J. Simpson Got Away with Murder, Helter Skelter, of course, his first book, 1974, The Betrayal of America, about the 2000 election, and The Sea Will Tell, about a 1974 murder case on Palmyra. No Island of Sanity, Paula Jones versus Bill Clinton, The Phoenix Solution on the Drug War, and his most recent, you called it your magnum opus?
Yeah, that's the book that Cindy Adams said, this is not a coffee table book, it is the coffee table.
Reclaiming History, The Assassination of President John F. Kennedy, about 1,600 words.
1,600 words?
1,600 pages, 40 billion words. Vincent Bugliosi has been our guest for the last 3 hours on In Depth. We thank you, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.